Okay. We are calling this work session into order. And we have a pretty full agenda for this work session. So let's get started. I think the first item on the agenda is the financial quarterly update.
Bless you. I'm allergic to being here.
Directors, this evening on the agenda, before we get to academic, obviously we're talking about our finances, but there's a new face here up front, and we're going to formally introduce her Tuesday at the regular meeting, but I also want to let you know who's here. It's Cynthia Lee, our new Chief Financial Officer here at Portland Public Schools. So
Welcome.
she brings many years of experience, most recently as in our neighboring Reynolds School District. So thank you for joining the team.
Yes, welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. It's good to see all of you. My name is Ryan Dutcher. I'm the interim budget director. I have Molly Bradley with me as well, and then you just met Cynthia Lay. So good to see all of you. Tonight we're going to, in your package, you have one of our first regular quarterly reports for the financials for the district. You've had this for a week, so I'd imagine you've probably been able to read through it and have some questions. The plan was we'd go through it at a relatively high level, kind of orient you to the content, and then take any questions you might have. And the goal of this is twofold. One is to make sure that we're giving you regular reporting on the financials. The other piece is to work to set a baseline, kind of foundational understanding of the financials for the district. Then when it comes time for a labor-intensive and an attention-intensive process like the budget, we're starting from a relatively stable baseline. So that's the goal of this. But to orient you, a couple different things. One of the foremost pieces is our forecast to actuals. So we're comparing our budget to the first quarter financials, and you'll see some details. We work through the presentation, but we have that, and then we also do a projection, so we can project out to the end of the fiscal year, and most importantly, establish what we expect to be as an ending fund balance. We also have projection on 2019-2020, so we're rolling some projections forward. When we published this, it was before the governor's budget came out, so we've done an analysis in the past couple days with the governor's budget as well, and we'll tell you where that oriented relative to our range. We also have an enrollment report, so we have a relatively high-level enrollment report that compares our enrollment as of October 1st compared to last year, and then also compared to the assumptions we used for the budget. We have a quarterly investment report, so you'll see where we stand from a cash point of view. Summary of our compliance with our local levy option. We have some commitments that we made with the state, and we want to formalize the fact that we're in compliance with those commitments. We also provided a quarterly real estate report, and it's an exhaustive listing of all of our contracts with all of our outside parties on our real estate. On a regular basis, we'll be bringing you just the changes rather than the long report. Lastly, we have a fund summary. PPS has a lot of different funds for a lot of different purposes. So we provide a fund summary with some definitions of what each of those funds is for, and then the amount that we're budgeting for 18-19. And then we did a slightly deeper dive on a couple of different funds that are a little obscure, both of them around PERS, and they both have independent purposes for managing our PERS expenses. So we'll talk about those. And then lastly, and I won't go through all the different pieces, there's an appendix that goes into at least one, in some cases two, levels of detail deeper on all the different pieces I just talked about. So if no questions, I can quickly go through the summary. Okay, so for from a financial point of view, for the first quarter of this year, actual revenue was trending slightly ahead of budget. So as of the publication of this document, we had $125.7 million received to date. As you can imagine, the last couple of weeks are an intensive time for collecting tax receipts, so we've collected upwards of $300 million over the past week since this was published. And our treasury manager was busily investing that over the past couple days. We had a one-time Comcast tax settlement. Comcast was in a tax dispute with the state of Oregon that was settled. PPS was one of the recipients, probably received the most actually more than Multnomah County out of that settlement. So that's a one-time revenue increase we'll see this year that we won't see in future years. Yeah.
Roughly how much was it?
$8 million for PPS.
What was
Uh,
it for the whole state?
Pardon me?
Just for curiosity, what was it for the whole state? 120.
Second here.
Okay.
Sorry, 1 second, I have it right here. in front of me.
Don't worry about it.
Okay,
It doesn't
yeah.
matter. Don't worry.
39, 40-some million. State. Yeah, so Comcast tax settlement. Our expenditures for the year are trending largely to where we expect them to be at this point. It's still early, we only have first quarter behind us, but expenditures trending as we expect them to. So when we look at the ending fund balance for this year, largely driven by the Comcast settlement. Our local option is trending a little bit ahead of what we expect it to be. At this point, still being early, we expect we'll have a little bit of good news from an ending fund balance point of view to the tune of $5 to $6 million. Okay? Over the past couple weeks, though, the collections have been a little bit softer relative to what we saw last year. So that's something we're not ready to comment on whether or not we're behind, but just something we're monitoring closely. So when we look forward to the fiscal year 1920, and we did a similar analysis when we did the budget, just to understand how 1920 we're going to shape up. And there were a couple things we were watching at the time. One was the fact that it was a new biennium, so we were doing some high-level estimates on how we thought that might trend. And the second was that we knew we had some large expenditures, mainly our PERS rates were going to increase pretty substantially for PPS. We've refreshed that analysis. High-level analysis, when we assume a couple different scenarios for state school fund, we look like we're going to have a shortfall of about $12 million. An important assumption is that we're going to be marching from a budget reserve. We'll be marching towards the board goal of 5 and 10%. So we're locking that into the assumption, but it points to a 1.5 to 2% shortfall. Since that time, and we forecasted a range. We've done a little bit deeper analysis with the governor's budget, and it still falls within that same range. Okay, I'll
So
talk
just a question, and I don't know if the mechanics of the special fund, if they have the tax revenue, that they're gonna set aside for the 180 days and potentially for the class sizes. Are there things that we do now that would potentially set us up that we may be disadvantaged if we've already paid for them ourselves?
I don't know the answer. I don't know the specifics what those might look like, so I'd have a hard time answering that with any confidence.
I really appreciate the question, and my initial thought is that, as people are so fond of saying, all the, the 197 districts, each one of us over the last 30 years has made very different choices, and Portland, one of Portland's choices has been to do everything we can to keep class sizes as small as possible. Are we going to end up being stuck if we're only going to be getting money to reduce class sizes, and they're going to look at us and say, hey, you're fine?
Yeah, I think that's the 800.
Yeah.
That's the $800 million is for both class size and the 180 days, and they put it in a special school improvement fund or school
Yep.
fund.
Very much like we got stuck on Measure 98 because,
Right.
of course,
We
we
already
already made these
Yep.
investments in
That's right.
CTE.
That's right.
But of course, that's not yet decided, so we could help shape that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a relatively easy part of our advocacy strategy to just have it based on, number of students and allotments on your enrollment relative to whatever the aspiration is for class size, regardless of where you are now. I mean, I can imagine basing it on where you are now.
This is why the category areas are important, and we stand behind them, but the specifics at the local area need to be flexible. This applies not just on the class size issue, which we definitely want to promote and support, but all the other areas that are being contemplated.
Well, I think we're gonna probably need to shape the flexibility.
Yeah.
Understood.
Madam Chair, member of the board, it's a great question. We don't have the answer for you tonight, but I'm going to go back and do some analysis and discuss with Claire Hertz, and we will get back to you with an answer. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple of quick points on our enrollment. So our enrollment, as of October 1st, and they're detailed farther, deeper in the package, we were slightly higher than last year, and by slightly, it was 24 students higher. More notably, we were 385 students below the assumption we assumed for our budget. And our, as you know, enrollment drives a lot of our staffing allocations for our schools. We didn't make any adjustments based on that lower enrollment, but it was a little bit less than what we'd assumed. And then the last piece on the summary here, once again, this is as of September 30th. Operating cash in our investment portfolio, district had $573 million in book value. We had $98.9 million of cash, of which about $18 million of that is in our PERS, in a PERS restricted use account.
And would you say, have we completed all of our reforms around cash management, or is there still work to be done there?
So, one of the most important pieces. So we did hire a highly qualified full-time treasury manager. So we're happy with the candidate we got on board. So we're no longer managing that through contractors. When we were managing it through contractors, we got into compliance. We went back through and refreshed all of our guidance to make sure we were on the right page. We are still in compliance. So everything is under control and in compliance, and we're investing in line with the board guidance. And if you would like to see that displayed in the numbers, that is actually broken out in the table on page 7. So you can see the maximum allowed per policy, and then our percent of portfolio next to it.
Just for the record, it's page 8.
Thank you,
Starts
page 8.
with- yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. No junk bonds, no. Guaranteed it.
Can I go back to the enrollment for 1
Yes.
second? So I know this is not your field, but are we doing any analysis of the enrollments? And if we can see any patterns in how the enrollments are playing out? Or are we planning to do such a thing?
So,
You mean-
Are we consistently off, or are we consistently on? What are the grade
You mean
levels?
relative to the deviation from the projections?
Well, I would say 2 things, actuals versus projections, and are we seeing any population trends? Are we seeing any trends at, different grade levels, or,
There's a couple of things that I would bring to your attention. First is in our southwest area schools, there is a lower than projection enrollment. As the housing prices continue to rise, the number of students, they move, right, with the housing costs. So we will bring more information back on enrollment. I think we're scheduled for a January report. So we'll bring more of that analysis to you. The other thing I would bring to your attention, while we're showing you enrollment right now, another area to be aware of is this is the first time this district is going to the hold harmless ADMW in a long time, which means we have less weightings in 18-19 than we had in 17-18. So our overall ADMW number for this year is lower than last year's. So that means we'll be held at the level of last year, and that's mostly because of poverty and ELL weightings. So we are having a significant demographic change in our district, and it is going to impact revenue. So as we're held harmless in 18-19, we'll have to stair step down for 19-20. So that's another consideration as we're going forward.
Is this because there's going to be less poverty?
Less poverty and less ELL.
And so the state has a hold harmless.
In the formula, whatever your ADMW is this year, if it's less than last year, you get to get paid at last year's level. But by next year, then it lowers to this year's current, which is a lower level. So if we end up in decline over time, we stair step down each year.
Just one man's opinion, but I think the trend you're talking about, Rita, that really is increasing, unfortunately, is volatility. What I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is that the shifts are much higher, much wider swings in enrollment from one year to the next for individual schools. Yes, fueled by gentrification, by people being priced out, by some schools looking much more attractive. And I think that one reflection of that is that while almost all of the elementary grades go down, high school grades go up. And we are seeing many more wealthier, established families moving in with high school students because they're established, they're older, they've got kids in high school.
And I also believe the modernization of our school, high
Yeah.
schools, is
Oh, yeah.
adding to that.
Yeah.
So I have a long-term sort of forecasting question. So knowing that we enter into labor agreements that are multi-year and we make a variety of decisions that can't just be unwound in a year, are we forecasting out, like doing a 5-year forecast and making adjustments to what we think we need to have in the contingency fund
So
to address that?
We will be. So this one is a one-year shot in time. We will be doing 5-year and longer-term forecasts.
Great, because I think that's going to be needed.
Yes, you all agree.
Part of this is training staff in a way that they haven't been asked to work in the past. So the financial report here, this is the first time you've had a projected ending fund balance for general fund in a long time. I don't know when the last time was, but it's been, so it's training staff how to think in those terms and how to develop those reports. And we will also, we're going to be using the Forecast 5 tool that Paul is excited to hear us using and developing that 5-year forecast. And we're going to incorporate that also with, we're collaborating with other large districts across the state in especially forecasting in the revenue component and working together as we go through this legislative session.
So I think this is great, this dashboard. So we're going to get this quarterly. And then eventually will we also have sort of the annual and then like a 3-year so we can see across the trends?
Yes, yeah, so on page 11, if our page numbers are coordinated, on page 11, we have the cadence of what we're committing to today, and that's a good one to add, because we do not have on here the long-term, the 3 to 5 year. Oh, okay, page 12, thank you.
I was to say, that's not what I have on
Page
mine.
12.
The 3 to 5 year projection, which is not on here, but we'll add that for the cadence.
Great. That'll be super helpful,
Yeah.
just to spot trends.
Yeah,
and-
it's a good exercise we need to do.
And since you mentioned revenue, the happy little story I see is that it looks like revenue is up over what we projected, which is nice. It's good that the state's taking, and the county, we are taking in more money from property tax and the state school fund. Feels a little like a drop in the bucket, but it's good. As you're looking at districts statewide getting together, do you think you're going to get more accurate? Do you think that collectively we are going to get more accurate at looking at what that's going to be? Good. Because I got 16 different ways to spend every nickel, so yeah.
16?
Was Comcast part of any kind of our budgeting projection? Or was that?
No, it was not. Yeah, it was not.
It's
And
lost
the,
it.
yeah.
So just as a philosophical question, why don't we take that 8 million and plunk it into our piggy bank? And, we're working on adding to our reserves. Why didn't it just go straight into reserves? Boom, done.
Well, I think by policy, I forget how much, but there is the policy that was passed a couple of years ago around the reserves requires that any new money, especially one-time money, some portion of it goes into reserves. I want to say half, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, I'd have to look. I don't remember the policy. And it's still I think, and Claire, correct me on this, I think we'd still need to appropriate it because it comes in as revenue, I think we'd still need to appropriate to a budgeted reserve as well, which would take the board.
And then in the summary, so next, net expected result, an increase of 6.4 million in the ending fund balance. And then as 4.8% of expenditures. I wasn't sure what.
Yeah, so I could have written that more clearly. Our ending fund balance would then be 4.8% of our expenditures. It would increase it to 4.8.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is this the time that we could ask a question about enrollment, or should we save those questions for another time?
I would prefer for us to bring a report to you, but if if you want to email me, there's specific curiosities about enrollment, then that'll help us incorporate what you're looking for
I mean,
in the
just
report.
generally, I was just looking at, there's some pretty big changes in schools that you wouldn't predict there to be like necessarily an unstable or transient that have some, Glencoe's a great example. It's like, what's happening there? It's got a pretty big drop. Just so where you have some outliers that aren't easily explained or that would be different from normal. I mean, there's no special program there. It's a fairly stable neighborhood program. Same thing with, Chapman, maybe there's more mobility, but still a pretty big drop.
Chapman, a big part is the Ramona and people making other choices. At that, most of the decreases in kindergarten, first grade. But I think generally speaking, your point is well taken that it is lack
The
of housing affordability.
Right.
And our facilities planning can also make a difference.
So we saw the same trend in Beaverton. I could see it by grade level, and that would have been the southeast portion of Beaverton, so just on the other side of the southwest of, of Portland. And that by grade level, I could see how the new families were not moving in to the area. So it's a very similar trend on the other side of the border.
Any other questions?
So the local option, so the legislation that was passed last year that increased the cap, when did that increase go into effect? Or our ability to, are we still at the same rate as we were before because we actually haven't referred something at a higher rate, or can we just automatically go up?
So it is within the new legislative cap, but I'm not sure I completely understand your question.
So the cap used to be 20%, and it's now 25. Do we actually have to ask the voters to go to the higher level, or are we just automatically move to the new higher level?
In terms of maximizing our yield within our
Right, so
ability
so-
where we were leaving money on the table before.
So it's
Or
the,
we're taking money that
I
wasn't.
thought it was
it's the
retroactive.
collection is happening appropriately. In terms, it's really about the difference in the compression between the real market value and the assessed value. And I understand that there's 3 limitations to how we collect the local option levy, and in the past, we would have hit one, where now we're within the 3. I
Maybe
don't
I'm
know
not
if I'm answering your
asking-
question.
So the cap used to be 20%, and now it's 25. Did we automatically go to the 25, or,
Yes,
okay.
yes. Because what we put before the voters is the rate per thousand, and then that gets calculated at the assessor's
Right.
office. So now I'm getting your question. Yes, it's at the assessor's office that does the collection calculation. Okay?
So are we now collecting at the maximum rate that we're allowed, which keeps us under that 25 cap, whereas before we were?
I'll go back and,
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the Multnomah County, because we just got a new report with the new tax bills, and let me go out and take a look at that. I have not done a deep dive in that yet. And actually, our new CFO will know how to make that deep dive as well. It's lovely
I'd be
to have a
happy to do
partner
so.
in our financials. It is
To
lovely.
do so far.
Oregon K-12 experience, I can't tell you how that warms my heart.
Just,
Love my contractors, don't get me wrong.
It's okay. It's okay.
Nice save.
Yeah.
So just, given our upcoming conversations about a local option, it would be great to get any sort of, information we have on its utilization in a multi-year frame, just so we can start looking at that sort of over the time period, and if we were to extend it, what the ramifications would be.
I understand the need for the analysis there, and we'll bring that back, especially as the board is looking at future local option levy.
Yeah, and that is something that the Community Budget Review Committee validates every year as well, and they do the calculations, actually look at the journal entries and how we're spending tracked, and then does a calculation on the number of additional educators we were hiring because of the local option. So you'll see that in all the CBRC reports as well, and we have a
So
history
it'd be
of
great
that.
to get like a rolled up and
Yeah,
summary.
over time, sure.
So we have a bunch of funds besides the general fund, and I understand about this much of them. I don't have, or I've forgotten the historical context of a lot of it. So, and if most of us are in that same boat, then maybe as we go through budget sessions through the year, you could pick them off one by one and do, like a one-page summary that we can file away and refer to on each one. That's
Most definitely. That's going to be happening with the next report.
awesome.
I would also say in our planning for the budget cycle, this from January through June, that we will be connecting with the board monthly, so you'll have 6 connections to the budget process from January through June. Okay?
I would volunteer to read them before you share them out as here's a layperson reading them and making sure it translates.
Excellent. Thank you so much for offering.
And I hope the CBRC is going to be used as well during the bond development, I mean,
Absolutely.
budget development.
Oh, yes.
I think what we're starting to inch into is you'll hear soon how staff is beginning to think about the budget development cycle and all the opportunities, not just for the board to obviously be engaged, but also for the community to also give input and be engaged. So we're getting a head start now, and I think you'll be hearing more details soon.
Just one other quick random question looking down the funds. The last one listed is, or one of the last ones listed is the self-insurance fund for workers' comp. Is that at an adequate level? Considering all the all the financial squeezes that we've been under over the years, is that at a
There
good
was a-
sustainable level, or
There was-
have we been cheating a little bit on, not cheating, but
Yeah.
lowballing a little bit on it, or?
Based on analysis done last budget season, we looked at it and that we had Jim involved with this also, and actually we were probably a little too robust in that area. And so based on previous.
Come on down.
So we actually narrowed down what we were actually putting into that fund based on what with usage. So we do feel very comfortable with that balance.
Excellent. Great. Guys are on top.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay, wait a minute, I think we have one more.
There was one little section that looked like a sentence got cut off on here for what it's
Oh.
worth. But that's,
What page?
On the,
it was the 350 General Obligation Funds Debt Service Fund activity. The last sentence, activity in this fund is related to the 2013, 2015, and 2017 general.
What page number?
Yep,
Oh,
you're
right
right.
here.
20,
Yep, I see it.
22
I see it,
on
thank
our
you.
copy.
I got it.
Yep.
Yep,
For
got
what
it.
it's,
Okay.
for what it's
Okay.
worth.
Yeah, no, thank you, that's good.
That was a test.
Okay, thank you.
everybody.
I'm sorry, and you really quickly, how are you doing getting some good budget software?
Oh,
Is that-
actually, we have started the implementation cycle of that. We're in our second week. We should be signing the design document in the next day or so, and with implementation plans, we should be live in the software by end of January.
Excellent.
So we're planning to use.
Wonderful news.
Wow.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
So,
But you're going to miss those Excel
more Excel,
spreadsheets.
exactly.
I know you are. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next item is guaranteed and viable curriculum.
Before our Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Luis Valentino, entertains us with the first of what we hope is a series of conversations around curriculum and assessment and other key areas. It's his birthday today.
Happy birthday.
As I was telling Julia, it's I'm spending it with the people I love, doing the work I thoroughly enjoy. Julie knows me, I guess. No, I am really happy and pleased to be here. The only challenge is that after this, I will have to drive to Eugene so that I can become a documented Oregonian because my license is from California. So a group of us are there taking courses starting tomorrow morning. So in my head, I'm spinning around, preparing for that as well. But I am happy to be here because it's a great opportunity for us to reconnect with you since last spring around the work that OTL has been engaged in the development and delivery of an integrated student-served support model. And so the work that we have engaged in since last year that has leveraged work that began a couple of years ago and before that is the manifestation of our intent to address issues of inequity and marginalization for a large number of students in Portland Public Schools, and to take the opportunity to address the predictive power of demographics so that regardless of where students live, where they come from, whatever experiences they have the same opportunity to work to their fullest potential. And so that has been a driver for us in how we think about this work. And so when we look at the delivery of support for our students, we think about what is the curriculum and the practices that's going to guide that learning opportunity for students. How are we going to monitor for progress and growth over time? And how are we going to build the capacity of those charged with leading this work? And that includes teachers, site administrators, and central office staff. And so tonight, the focus of that, which is multifaceted, will focus on two things. The guaranteed and viable curriculum with some focus on the literacy aspect, which has been the primary rollout with mathematics and science right behind it. And Dr. Kimberly Mateer is going to share that, and then we'll engage hopefully in a conversation around that. And then after will be the second piece, which is on the assessment framework, at which Dr. Sarah Davis will share with you, and hopefully we'll engage in that. But as you listen to both presentations, the takeaway will hopefully be one that independently, they are designed to bring about a more comprehensive approach to teaching and learning, and the way in which we learn about the quality of that learning through a comprehensive data management approach. And so if we are vision-driven, we still have to be data-informed. And so how do we pay attention to that in the context of the work that we are developing and preparing for our students? And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Mateer, and then we will then engage in conversation.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So I'm just going to give you a brief overview and talk a little bit about where we are in terms of our updates from last year and move into questions. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Maybe I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, it's not
It's on
moving.
the right mouse click, so if you,
Oh.
then you go.
Okay, thank you. All right. So we do have 3 objectives for our conversation tonight. We really just want to kind of give an overview of the components of our guaranteed and viable curriculum, the process that we are going through to develop that, talk about some of the training and instructional supports that are being developed, and the implementation status. So those are the 3 areas of focus for our conversation. And as Dr. Valentino talked about, really the purpose of providing a guaranteed and viable curriculum is to ensure that we have a quality education for every one of our students in every classroom in every school. And so as we think about what it means to have a guaranteed curriculum, it's really making sure that all of our teachers are aware of what our students need to know and be able to do so that we can ensure their success beyond school. And then the viability piece of that is really about making sure that we have the time in which to cover all of the content so that the students are able to access that rigorous learning opportunity.
I have a question about that.
Yes.
So the amount of instructional time, especially in the high schools, has been a widely discussed topic, but I'm wondering, by our professional judgment, do we have enough time to teach the content that we're saying that our students should master at all levels?
That's a very good question. I think it will depend on how the implementation and design happens with the classroom teacher, because every teacher has an instructional approach. I think for certain students, for particular populations of students, for example, our students who are duly identified, if they're receiving special education services, language services, and things like that, there may be more strain in terms of the instructional time for providing all of the quality components of an education system in terms of looking at enrichment and what's happening not only in core but beyond core instruction as well. So I know that we're looking at time. We're very tight on that. We would, if there was opportunities to expand some of that during the day, that's great. But I know we're looking at a 6-8 team is looking at a task force is looking at the instructional minutes and how we might improve on that for particular students, populations of students.
Like, for example, for say 4th grade. So here's all the things that we expect a 4th grade teacher, the curriculum we expect, and removing sort of maybe the outliers. Do we know how much time that should take, and whether or not that's actually provided in the
Yes, so
in our school day?
So we are providing a scope and sequence, which is a pacing guide, and we'll get into that a little bit into the presentation. That helps to provide that guidance for teachers around how much time you should be spending. And that is an important part of why we have a pacing guide, to make sure that we're spending the appropriate amount of time on each content piece or content area.
Thank you.
There is no question that inside of a comprehensive standards-based instructional program, there is an expectation in the shifts in the way students learn, in the way teachers teach, and in the way site administrators lead, and the way that we support. One of the learnings that comes from that is the amount of content that is inside of each of the disciplines. There is no question. And so one of the things that has to happen when a scope and sequence is being developed is to be mindful in its development that it falls within the time blocks that are available in that school. And in some cases, it can provide a challenge. There is no question. And so that's why the iteration of our work has to be aware of that, and it has to incorporate the feedback that is received about what is working and what is not. It's not static. It is a dynamic process that from the first iteration we've learned a lot, and we will continue to learn, because there is a lot to it. There is no question. And so we need to be aware of that, those of us developing this work, as we work with our sites.
Well, I appreciate you have to work, your nuanced answer, and that you have to work within the limits that we have. We got the shortest school year, or one of them, in the country. We have a crying need for extending, the school year into the summer. We have kids who have big drop-offs in their retention, I would have felt more comfortable if you just said, no, we don't have enough time to do what we need. Because I don't think we do, and that's why we're going down to Salem talking about adding more days to the school year. And especially if you throw in acceleration on one end, all the differentiation that we need to do around language, around special education, just...
Which is where I see even a more fundamental problem. I really appreciate the emphasis on the number of minutes, but this is not what I would think of. This really literally was not what I thought was meant by guaranteed and viable curriculum, because we've gone many, many years where core classes were not offered, and in many instances where they were, it didn't do the kid any good because you couldn't actually get to it. And of course, it was always the historically underserved students who were denied the opportunity to take the course. In terms of just on paper, offering the courses, from what I've seen so far this year, we seem to be doing a much better job. But is that list of courses in fact viable? Have we got all of the kids getting into core classes? For our middle school students, 7th and 8th grade, theoretically, they've got the opportunity to take compacted math. Is it made available at a time when, yes, our ELL kids can actually take it? Those are the questions that keep me up at night.
Right. And they're great questions. And I think one of the things, when we think about the design of the guaranteed and viable curriculum and how we get at some of the challenges that Dr. Valentino alluded to, is about how are we integrating, so he used the word integrated, how are we integrating our work and working and making sure that our instructional design is actually meeting a variety of different needs. And so I think as a part of the GVC design, which I'll kind of talk about here. So it is a standards-based approach to creating a viable and guaranteed curriculum. So we're looking at how we prioritize the standards. And so we're prioritizing particular essential learning components or essential learning content, but then we talk about the supporting standards to how do we scaffold that learning to get to this larger, more essential learning. In addition to that, we're integrating English language proficiency standards and really working with teachers about how do those things work together, so that we're looking at oral language development or language acquisition at the same time that we're teaching in our content areas. And so integrating those components and being more intentional around that is providing that service for our students who need additional language supports beyond the classroom day. And so it helps with the challenges of scheduling and also making sure that we're meeting the needs of our students as well. So then when we also talk about the curriculum map, it does provide a pacing guide to give, again, as we think about how students are being responsive to the way that instruction is being designed and delivered, are we on track, or are we keeping students in a particular learning too long? So it gives us a way to evaluate, are we helping our students to move along and making sure that they are being responsive. So the part of that curriculum map really spells out different components that will be helpful for teachers to think about how they're making decisions around the teaching and learning process. The assessments then will be used not only after the instruction has occurred to see have they learned what we want them to learn, but are they learning all along the way? Are they responding at each component part of the lesson?
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Can we go back to the curriculum map?
Yes.
I'm not sure I get what you're...
So the curriculum map we'll lay out, and we'll look at an example of that, but it lays out the different curriculum resources that teachers can use, and one of that is the standards-based scope and sequence. So it talks about when students should be learning, for how long, how many lessons will you spend on this topic, and that kind of thing. And so we'll look at the specific components of the map in the next slide. But that gives a guide. It's not lock and step, but it lets the teachers evaluate kind of the decision making that they're doing as they are designing and delivering instruction.
Okay, I don't want to belabor it, but I guess I'm not getting the difference between the scope and sequence in the map.
Yes. Okay, so let me move forward just to...
This is a subset.
Yes, it's a subset. It's a component of the map. So here is a kind of visual of the scope and sequence. It's the year at a glance, so we'll let you know when you should be teaching the topics each month, how many lessons. It gives you a guide for our time frame for those lessons. And then here's the map. Here are the other components of that. So you have your scope and sequence, but then it also gives a unifying theme. So what are we going to be learning about in this unit? Here's an example of multiplication and division and the connection and the relationship between those things. It'll take 20 days approximately. This is just a guide. Again, it will call out what is the essential learning that we want students to be taking away beyond this unit, what will carry over. It will have questions that will kind of frame how we want students to be thinking and the way that they should be investigating some of the learning that they'll be going through. The learning targets are really how we chunk the learning or define the learning in discrete ways so that students can process and manage around that learning. And then we have the unit overview, which really describes how all of these pieces tie together.
Dr. Matier?
Yes.
So back to the question about instructional time, I'm just curious, so you're pretty specific there, 20 days. So is that just your efforts to back map for Portland Public Schools based on the instructional time we have, or is that connected in any way to best practices or, other
Right.
knowledge about how long it actually takes to teach this material?
It's based on the best practices around how long it actually takes to teach the material. It's not really defined around our time.
got.
Right.
Okay, good.
But also, as a result of that, one of the things that we also needed to be aware of is, as the units are being developed with a particular time frame in mind, as we look at the quarterly assessing period, how does it land and where does it land, right? To make sure that it's a normal integration between the instructional piece and the assessment piece, to sort of determine the level of progress and growth over that quarter. And so not all units are constructed the same. right? And teachers do make decisions, and there are buffers on either end, because as a teacher, when you receive the unit of study, then you have to make decisions inside of the lessons that are being built, the length of time that a lesson will take. Some lessons will be fairly quick, some will take more time, some need some acceleration, some need enrichment, some will need a little bit more support. So there has to be some buffer on either end of that 20 days, for example, that give teachers an opportunity to make decisions. And this is something that we've had to think about across all disciplines, because it's not just in language arts, it's in math as well. So building in a mindset that says there is flexibility in the way I think about my unit and my lesson is critical, because we didn't want to standardize it to the point where the decisions were not being made. If you look at the slide, can you go back to the one that actually has what the district does versus what the teacher does? Go back a few more. Go back somewhere. There. So there is what the system-wide expectations are, right? But then at the school level, when they're planning their lessons and the instructional delivery, there are a lot of decisions that a teacher has to make. There are a lot of decisions that a grade level they have to make. And so they make decisions both about the quantity and the quality of that work. And then that is the time allotment.
Yeah. Yes.
It's a comment, I'm sure you're used to me hearing, MTSS, look, it's there. However, I don't understand why it's like in the middle of this listing, because it's really an overarching framework, which core falls
Right.
under there, all assessments and
Yes.
secondary and tertiary supports. I mean, so I'm.
So all of these components really work together, and so it's may not be the best graphic, but they're just the components, so the things that we're thinking about. So as we think about MTSS, we're thinking about core, not only when we think about core instruction, but when we talk about Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction, what are the instructional scaffolds that we're embedding in core instruction, so that we're not just moving to an external program to meet student needs, but how are we really defining what's happening with our teachers who are spending the most time with our students, and designing quality instruction to meet the variety of needs. So MTSS is embedded in all elements, but I think we're just specifically calling out the components.
It can't be embedded. It is the framework.
It is.
Well, then I'm really confused about the embedding part.
So,
And I don't think it's just philosophical. I think that it's.
So when you,
Because, again, that really drives what core looks like and how you provide the scaffolds in core. But
Correct.
core is not going to meet the needs of all students. We know that.
right.
So then, I mean, it's just the system that is the overall system of getting kids to get to standards, get closest to standards as they can.
Yes.
so MTSS as a framework that looks at good first instruction as the driver,
Yes.
understanding that perhaps 85 to 90% of students will get it with good first instruction, which has been the focus of the GVC work, right? Understanding that there will be that 15% of students who will need additional support. The expectation as we develop that framework and we begin to look at RTI to begin to intervene within the good first instruction, right? That we provide the supports necessary for teachers in that same space to address the needs with expanded support. We don't want to move to Tier 2 and Tier 3 without fully addressing Tier 1, right?
Absolutely, but I think it's problematic if we don't consider it as a system and solely focus on core, because there are those kids that we're kind of leaving behind if we don't have those systems in place for them. And Tiers 2 and 3 can't just be expanded core or scaffolded core.
No, and so I want to make sure I clarify. It's not. We're emphasizing Tier 1 at this time in the process of our GVC development. And the idea is that we are really trying to think from an interdisciplinary team or integrated team approach to how we are designing and delivering instruction for all students, making sure that our core instruction is solid before we start talking about tier 2 or tier 3, because oftentimes we rush to look at what's happening outside of the classroom to deliver services for students, and then we miss opportunities to really get them what they need. And so sometimes they'll spend more time in remedial kinds of supports when we can accelerate them through core. And so I just wanted to emphasize that part and talk about why we are explicitly calling out these components around the GVC. But the main piece of this is that there are centrally or centralized developed infrastructure and resources that we're trying to provide, but most of how the GVC gets implemented is really around school-based decision-making in these particular areas. Lesson planning, instructional delivery again, and then the resources that they use to design and deliver instruction.
Can I stop you for 1 second?
Yes.
Scott, did you have questions?
I thought maybe I'd just hold off and just let you get through the
Okay.
presentation, get a flow to it, and then
Okay.
come back. Thank you.
So we looked at the curriculum map, and in your packet you have an example of a 4th grade actual unit that's outlined, so you can see how those components are being described for our teachers. Again, just to clarify, the units are based on a series of lessons that are organized around a theme. It defines the content focus. Our priority standards really describe what students should know and be able to do. It declares a higher degree of instructional emphasis. And then we also talk about what are the language demands within that learning that students should be paying, that teachers should support the students in their development.
Where are the language? Where's that?
So they're embedded in a part of the map.
You have a picture of the top portion of the curriculum map.
Oh.
Each curriculum map is 4 to 5 pages long.
Oh.
Yes.
And so it's just farther down on the page.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And are these common core standards? Or just-
Yes. So as we look at where we're currently at in terms of the GVC development, so we started in the spring with English language arts and math as our primary content areas for development.
Is that K-12?
Yes. And
Is that true by every subject area?
That it's K-12?
well, yes, for the content areas that we have developed so far. And we will be moving through that process with the remaining content areas as well. And so you'll see the projected work that we have to continue developing in all of our content areas with science, health, social studies. Ethnic studies is a part of the same timeline, but there will be some differences in the process of development, and we'll be working with a variety of different partners for that particular scope of work. But you'll see that we're trying to continue the same process that we have started with English language arts and math, but we will extend the process of development out a year, and so it will be a 2-year process for developing the extended content areas, for the additional content areas.
What has been modified since the spring is the pace of implementation, because one of the things that we needed to address was the preparation of all teachers to be able to implement, right? So one is developing with a great deal of ambition, and the second is the reality of how fast can you actually roll this out so that it actually has the right impact in the school and the classroom. And so with some guidance, some changes to the rollout process have been made to make sure that we actually are pacing it properly. And so, but the development does continue to ensure that as we begin to align all of the disciplines around the GVC, that we're ready to roll them out in the right sequence, as more and more teachers gain access to the right levels of support along the way. And so we're hoping that as we move from literacy, from the language arts program to mathematics, that then science follows. To your question, Julia, about whether it's K-12, it will and has and it will begin to differentiate some. In areas where you have single subject teachers, there are aspects, for example, in science, when you actually can focus there, where at the elementary level you might not be focusing at the same time. Because of the next generation science standards being right behind, we have to be aware of that as well and mindful about that. And so as we look at the science sequence and then later we look at the math course sequence, those are conversations that are now on the table as to what will be the focus, whether it be secondary, middle, or elementary. Right now, we're all in the same place, but eventually we see some divergence away from all of it being K-12 simultaneously, but we're not there yet.
Dr. Valentino, with
Yes, ma'am.
respect to the professional development piece you were just talking about, can you just give us a high altitude assessment of these specific curriculum expectations relative to where we have been? Relative to the status quo prior to implementation?
Prior to the implementation?
So we can have a sense of the scale of the change in expectation.
Searching for a polite way to put that.
The-
I think it's important, I mean, it's important to me to feel like I have an understanding of how different the expectation is for individual teachers and how different the experience may really look in the classroom.
So, conceptually speaking, not necessarily around expectation, right? That when we're implementing a comprehensive standards-based instructional program, the expectation is that we teach to standard, not to program. In teaching to standard, then it is the understanding that teachers and site leaders and central offices have provided some support or continue support around what it means to teach in a standards-based environment. So that means understanding what teaching the standards mean, what a scope and sequence means. In other words, to what depth and to what length are we teaching to a particular set of standards? What is the order and sequence of those standards? What are the units that will be developed to ensure that it contextualizes the teaching of those standards and the learning of those standards? What are the lessons that a teacher will be planning in a comprehensive way so that it becomes observable and measurable that that practice is taking place in the classroom and that learning is actually taking place? So then we need to be able to have an assessment system within the school district that allows for us to measure progress and growth over time and to use that data to inform how well the students did, but also how well we performed in the teaching of that lesson. And so we make decisions both on a daily basis in a formative way that allows us to make adjustments to the lesson that we're teaching, but also in the long-term way that says from lesson to lesson, this is where I'm going to adjust. Mm-hmm. From unit to unit, these are the changes that I need to make. Across the quarters, because I know there are measures that are quarterly, what do I need to make sure that I prepare the students to do well on, and where are the challenges in my classroom, right? Within the standard environment, you also have the expectation that teachers teach to a high ceiling and a low floor, to teach to high cognitive demand. That's the hardest part, because you're asking them to teach to high cognitive tasks, rigorous tasks, right, that measure in a comprehensive way what students are learning after having engaged in that lesson, right? In most cases, the best way to assess a student is through the observation that a teacher does because they know the students best. But that is not the only way. An assessment system has to be comprehensive. It has to measure over time. And it has to be both internal, but also externally calibrated. That allows for us to be able to compare across the school district. That means that in your question, there is an expectation that across the entire system, all students are having access to that rigorous instruction, and that we can actually, regardless of where they live and where they go to school, we're able to compare apples to apples.
So you said that we're working towards teaching to a standard, not to a program, but it's also, we have a little bit of a concern that we're teaching to one approach or one philosophy, because particularly in our literacy approach, it's very much a workshop-based approach, and that has not held up with data. There's no research to support its efficacy really with students with disabilities such as dyslexia or English learners. So how do we propose then to broaden our toolbox and our approaches to really train our gen ed teachers with how we work with those that are struggling learners, particularly around literacy? I think that's our biggest percentage of kids with language-based disabilities. They're going to struggle in literacy, and that's about 20% of a population, and then not to mention the percentage of English learners we have. So if we only are really focusing on one approach, I worry that we're missing 30% of any classroom of children with their ability to learn from core.
I do not disagree. The learning theory in Portland Public Schools is one that is fairly constructivist, right? It's about the co-construction, right? But as an overarching theory. But when you say some kids, that's where the issue is, right? Because not all students will acquire the necessary knowledge base or skill set to succeed as they progress through the grades if we don't intervene and intervene early. And when you're talking about students who fall behind early, students whose language needs have a high demand behind them, all of those things require also that within the workshop model that you described, which is teaching and writing, that is relatively co-constructed, that some of the skills necessary to access that content becomes limited for many students. And so how are we intervening early to address those things? Well, one of the things that we have to think about, and this is where Deputy Superintendent Curtis can really share, because she has a very similar concern. And so we are beginning to address that more directly, that if we are addressing the needs of a group of students who are not accessing the core because they cannot read well or they cannot write well, then all of the GVC work goes by the wayside because they're not accessing it. So what are we doing to ensure that we address that? And that's where we are in the middle of studying that. And I know Dr. Mateer has a position on that as well, because it is a concern that we have. And so when we talk about a balanced approach to literacy, we have to be very careful what we mean by that, to ensure that we are providing full access to the instructional core.
Exactly, in core, and I've seen some systems then that will say, well, the ones that are falling behind, the whole group of English learners, or all of the kids that are, at risk for dyslexia, whatever, then we just send them to tiers 2 and 3, for that extra, but really, this needs to be dealt with when we're rolling out core.
Right, correct. And that is a part of,
That's that equity piece.
yes, absolutely. And I think as we look at the balanced literacy system, it's about being very explicit and working with teachers about how do we create those intentional instructional supports within core, and what does that look like within a balanced literacy system, and providing the ongoing training and supports to help build the capacity of our teachers to deliver in that way. And this is why working in an integrated service delivery team is critical. So our ESL teachers are right alongside in the facilitation of our professional learning Our special education educators are alongside and facilitating the professional learning. And so we cannot afford to work in isolation with each other. And so the reorganization and the redesign of our teams is about working in an integrated or interdisciplinary way when we're creating our professional learning, when we're rolling out supports, when we're doing any coaching or pushing into the schools. We're not looking at it from a single lens. And so MTSS, while we're under the Division of Student Support Services, is helping to co-design our professional learning for teachers in the same way that ESL and DLI were all working together to do that, to build the capacity of our classroom or core teachers to deliver instruction for all students.
So, there's at least one board member who doesn't understand what co-constructivist means, and I would wager if anybody's following this in the public, probably 99% don't understand. So this is a challenging discussion because, you know,
There's a lot of
Julie gets it. But if you want to bring the rest of us along, you know, this is exactly what we're talking about, right? I need a tier 2 intervention here.
You need good access to the tier 1 content.
Yes.
Right, so I can access the tier 1 content because So I would ask, all staff when making presentations, but especially around the professional curriculum, educational part, is that you're teaching. And the materials you provide us with should be as if you're teaching. And if you have terms here that aren't defined and go right over my head, you're going to lose me, and you know, I'm going to be like one of those kids, and I'm going to start playing with my pencil and, you know,
Paper airplanes.
shooting spit wads. Yeah. So
Yes.
that would help. There's, you know, gradual release shows up here, and I went, is that catch and release? Is that so I would ask you as we go along at this to take that into consideration.
Yes, thank you.
This is great feedback because then, as the teacher, that feedback is how I respond to that. So this formative assessment is telling me, formative, right now, that the way that we're sharing with you might require some scaffolding, right? Some built-in supports, temporary supports, until the language is, we're on the same page on the vocabulary, on some of the concepts, right? And then possibly through hands-on, the skills development, right? So in the lesson, there are 3 things that we look at: concept, skills, and language. And so the concepts that we're sharing with you might be a little bit too abstract. So how do we make them more real for you, more concrete? The skills that are acquired as teachers who've been doing this for a long time. How do we accelerate that for you in a safe space for you to experience that? And then the lexicon that we're developing, which is language that the educators behind me have used throughout their career. For us, it's like normal, but we have to be aware that it's not normal for everyone. And so how do we use language that is more relevant and useful? So that's information for us, so that when we come back in the future, we will make sure that we have addressed that. So that's how we're addressing the feedback that we're getting from you.
I bet if we had a test at the end.
There will be a summative assessment.
Online, pull up your device.
That is the budget process.
So is this one of the, when you were doing the accelerated scope and sequence work, is this what you were producing?
Yes.
Okay. So seeing like the whole thing for one, you know, for grade 4 or for a piece of grade 4 math would have been great, and going through it from my point of view.
Okay.
And kind of going through it, and it would get to, and I think the concerns, well, you know, on the one hand, you're building from nothing. Okay, we get that. and in a hurry. Not nothing, but, and on the, in terms of the central office, and then on the other hand, so sorry, this is central, okay, just want to be clear here. That the concerns are you're building that tier 1 without the acceleration, without the ELL, without the special ed, and those are sort of add-on components as part of what I've been thinking, and I don't know if that captures part of what.
Except I heard her saying that they're working with those departments. Building this.
Yes.
As it went on, I heard that more, but getting into, I think, more concrete would show maybe where those are.
So that is something we'd like to come back multiple times to do. For today's, we understood that it was supposed to be an overview, and our struggle is always there is so much, and how do we find the time to do the teaching on every component? What we'd like to do is bring back smaller components and have opportunities, hands-on or whatever the discussion or strategy we use, we could model strategies as well as the content. Today, what we had planned to do, and we actually took out a lot of it anyway, but we wanted to make sure we had a chance to share with you and link back to what we shared in the spring, how the work is continuing to develop, and then what we have left to do, and then how the assessment framework fits along with that. It is a lot of information, so I want to say I'm sorry, but I also want to say I want to give you all the information so you know that it's there. And then by your questions, we can come back and talk about specifics. So one of the issue you talk about, Julie, you and I've talked about it. I'm really familiar with that. There are different theoretical bases for what Julie's talking about and the way that the Common Core were developed. And even within our whole DISCO, we are having opportunities for us to even discuss between us, what do we mean? Do we have the same shared understanding? And I'm sure many of our teachers are also wanting to have the same conversation. So this is so complex and so deep that we have to come to consensus as we're working on it. That's why it's an iterative process.
I want to make sure, too, that you're basing it on what we know of the science of reading, for example, because I have yet to see anything that lists out the 5 components of reading. Where is that in here? I've
So
never
when
seen
we
it
get
within
to the
our-
literacy, you will see it.
Great.
But again, it follows a constructivist. So we know there's another part that needs to be balanced, and constructivist comes from a view of for lay people that students will help construct their own meaning versus being directly taught. And we know that both ways are needed. And some areas we would teach more at the younger grades around phonics and phonemic awareness, and that is the part that I've shared with you. We don't have as strongly rooted in our language arts adoption, but we are looking at ways to implement that. So that's coming.
Right.
Along with the budget requests.
And then I also wanted to say, though, from my perspective, I mean, it makes sense that we're looking at standards. What standards are going to help us, are going to give us the most bang for our bucks? How are we going to go about, here are some ways, here are some things to think about as you're planning your lessons, and it's not prescribed what teachers are using, which has not been what teachers want
And I would
to
just
be prescribed, but you give them enough guidance, and here is what we're going to hold for students learning. Here's where they need to be. I mean, so I understand the work that you're doing, and it's making sense. There's just pieces. We want to make sure that we're talking about all learners and that we're providing enough knowledge, a broad range of knowledge, that we're going to make sure to meet the needs of all of our learners.
Right. I do think those are some of the unique elements of the Portland GVC design. When we talk about the other components of reading in terms of the foundational, building the foundational reading skills in the Big Five, we do have resources for teachers and routines. It's just not integrated into the the EBBL model, and so we're working on building those pieces so that the relationship between all of the literacy components will be very explicit, and that teachers are able to deliver for all students.
And I just want to remind everybody that we all came on board after the adoption.
Yeah.
And then built a GVC. That's not
Yeah.
really the right order.
Right.
So we are doing what we can to make it comprehensible for people
And to, as you say.
and to make it work for all
to
students.
fill the gaps
Yes.
that we had in some of the.
And we're not done
foundational
yet.
areas.
Okay, so what you just said, that sends off like alarm bells in my head.
The
That-
literacy
That
adoption.
the literacy adoption happened, we're out of sequence, right?
Yeah.
So we've adopted some stuff, and I've heard, about the literacy adoption, I have heard very strong opinions on basically all sides of the question. I have heard people who hate it, I have heard people who love it, and most people are somewhere in the middle.
Which is true with any adoption anywhere I've ever been.
Okay, but I gotta say, relatively speaking, I've heard a lot more on the negative side than the positive side. So here's my
Hard to
question.
do.
So we're up here, we are not educators, with one exception. And the way you guys talk is a foreign language, in case you didn't know. It is. And I worry that, okay, and PPS has not, in recent years, been as deliberate and intentional and farsighted as it might have been. So we've made some investments in some things. And I don't have, based on my experience, I don't have a lot of confidence that the investments we made were the best. So I worry that we're just doubling down on stuff that was not a great idea.
So I just want to say the materials we've purchased are good materials. We have literature, we have books in the classroom for the kids, we have writing units. So we have a good start. There are elements that we're going to have to fill in with, and we can do that because it's all about it's focused on the standard and how you teach the standard. You can use any set of materials. We are just in the middle of identifying to help support teachers how to use the materials they have to address those standards. I think it will help if we get farther through the presentation because the elements, when we get through the literacy piece, that gives you a little bit more focus on one content area and what we are doing with the literacy.
But I do
adoption.
also want to address what you said. We chose the harder path. What we did was we chose five separate programs that we called a bundle, to bundle together that have no research, they don't tie together, versus what many districts do that use a state adoption because it's a curriculum that's there and it supports teachers. It's just what we have and why it's seeming more difficult. It requires a lot of professional development, and that takes a lot of resources.
And it's where we're at.
Yep.
Can I ask a question about the professional learning? So you talked a little bit about the teachers. What are we doing with the principals so that they're the instructional leader in their schools? Are they the ones ultimately who are mostly responsible for the professional development around this, or what's being done at that level? Because it seems like we're going from the central office to the teacher in the classroom, and I'm sure there's a link.
There has, the superintendent has made it very clear to all of us that there's an expectation that we support our site administrators so that they are the instructional leaders at the site. And that is a tall order, using your previous comments about where we have been, that we have to accelerate that and do a lot of scaffolding around that and supporting that, because there are a lot of things that a principal does during the course of a day. But if they are to be the instructional leader, what will that look like in their learning? So we're working together with OSP and OSS, and the three of us form DISCO under Dr. Curtis, and the goal is to integrate our learning, integrate the work, supporting the assistant superintendents and the senior directors, so that they too then become instructional leaders and are able to lend support at schools. At the same time, we have our regular administrator institutes, and you can speak more to that directly in a second, but it really is designed to develop their capacity as learners and as teachers, so that they can then be instructional leaders in the content that is being delivered, through the content that is being delivered to them, so that they can then go back to their sites and deliver on that work, to lend the support at the school site, to give the feedback, and to provide enhanced support as needed with our support in our office. And so principals then will continue working with us around the instructional core, which is the GVC work, so that they can then deliver on that. At the same time, there will be expanded support over the summer into the fall, and we're going to be much more deliberate now that we have expectations and agreements on what that work will look like at the school, that we focus on those things, as opposed to providing a broad array of things. That now that we've provided the overview, we provide general understanding of how teaching and learning happens and the strategies that are best practice, to then narrow the focus so that they can actually observe and support for those things. So we've broken it down in terms of the written curriculum, which is what we've been talking about, what is developed. The taught curriculum, which is what happens in the classroom between the teacher, the student, and the resources, and that's the instructional core. And then the assessed curriculum, what is measured over time to see whether the student did well and whether we did well. And so we are focusing on the written curriculum. So the written curriculum includes units of study and lessons. So if an assistant superintendent or a principal or even the superintendent is visiting a school, there is an expectation that there is some evidence of planning instruction, right? What does that look like? At this point, that's a site-based decision. But there should be some expectation that a lesson is being planned, that is being taught, that it's observable that that lesson was being planned, right? To the degree that that happens, that's work that we will continue to do. But if we start there, then we began to calibrate across the district that lessons are being planned and that there's evidence of that. A principal can then give feedback to that. But if we're asking the principal to give feedback on whether there were learning targets or learning objectives, which are what do we expect the student to know and be able to do by the end of the lesson, then we need to be able to prepare administrators to be able to look for those things and to be able to give quality feedback to those things, to support teachers to be able to do that when there is no evidence or limited evidence of that.
So, but if this is a new skill for them around this curriculum, so are they primarily getting their instruction or their PD at Administrators Academy, or are you giving them like a textbook and they've got to study and then they have the Administrative Academy? How are they getting the content and interacting with them? Because 100 different things are happening during the school day.
Yes, very true.
Presumably, that's also the benefit of the entire restructuring of the, with the deputy superintendents who are in their buildings, 4 out of 5 days a week.
Right.
or however many days it is, yeah.
So there are a number of structural supports that we have that we're designing for the principals, and one of them is the Leadership Institute, but they also have regular cohort meetings in which they're also receiving professional learning support, and we really try to align all of those structures so that we're reinforcing the learning and that they're getting multiple opportunities and touch points around the learning that we need them to do. We are designing or redesigning the Leadership Institute in a way that follows best practice. So we've chunked the learning. So you heard Dr. Curtis talk about, we're starting with the written curriculum. We're looking at the standards. We're starting with the unit plan and then moving towards lesson planning. But we work with the principals and we talk about what do the teachers need to know and be able to do to implement a standards-based instructional program. And then what are the things that you need to have in place to support the teachers so that they can do that in a high-quality way. So we say, what does that sound like? What does that look like? What infrastructure needs to be in place? How do you build consensus with your staff so that there's shared understanding around the language that we use, the content that we use? And so we use a framework around how do we scaffold the learning for staff? And so how do we make the learning accessible to the teachers in the way that we would want them to do that for the students, so that we're modeling that. We also talk about what's a meaningful context, so we're not just talking about learning in absence of what are you doing in your building. So we'll look at specific things that are happening in their building and then try to see how does that learning apply to what decisions you're making at your site, because a lot of it is site-based decision making. And then we have what we call a community of practice. So they'll be working in PLCs. They'll be looking at problems of practice within their building and then applying that learning to their problem of practice so that they can begin to see how do we work through some of the challenges that we have towards implementing a literacy system that works for every student. And we know that some of the challenges are the same across the building, but then some of them are also unique. We are providing them with toolkits as well so that they can extend their learning back at their site. We call those instructional guides. We have embedded in there videos and research articles and different activities that they can engage with their teachers in so that they will begin to practice around that learning and get a deeper sense of what does this all mean. In addition to that, we are providing what we call guidance around how to actually do observation and feedback around these different elements that they're learning. So we are starting with the written curriculum. So let's say, what have we learned about unit planning? How would you check or have a conversation with your teacher around how they're planning using the GVC resources, for example? Are you in pace with the pacing guide or the scope and sequence? If not, tell me what's going on. Are the students being responsive around the decisions that you made? If not, what do you plan to do about that? Looking at the assessment data, those kinds of discussions at the Leadership Institute, and then those are reinforced in their cohort meetings with their area superintendents and area directors. And they also then look at infrastructure. How do you use your PLCs? Do you have an instructional leadership team? How do you use them to work with you in supporting all of your staff? So we try to really break out or chunk that learning over time so that we're not teaching it all, but we want to be explicit. We want to model the behavior, and so we give the resources at site, but then they can embed those back at their site as well. In addition to that, we are establishing a principal leadership cadre, so those principals who are showing higher levels of skill and knowledge around specific competencies that we want them to have will be leading or facilitating around specific learning components at the Leadership Institute. So we have several principles that are identified around literacy at this time, and so we're focusing on that, building that cadre, and then we'll move into other content areas later on.
So I have a couple of general questions before we get into the literacy that we want to get into. So you talked about, 20 days for this unit of material, plus or minus. I'm guessing that plus or minus is going to be more plus at lower income schools. And the pacing is going to be different, and maybe different years depending on, you talk to teachers, you talk, wow, this year's class is hitting it out of the park. This year's class is needing more time to, that becomes an equity issue, because I'm guessing on balance that higher income it can go at a faster pace than an average lower income school, unless there's more resources, lower class sizes, etc. So I just want to raise that as an issue. And again, I'm going to ask some questions. I don't expect to have full answers now, but just to get them out there. That's one. Materials being optional or at the discretion of at the school level. On the one hand, as a teacher, I want to have that flexibility. On the other hand, will that again play into some equity issues in terms of the level of challenge from different materials? And I've watched that through. I was on a textbook adoptions committee 10 years ago in social studies, and I watched the conversation about, well, this textbook I'm not going to use because my kids won't be challenged, while at another school it's like, I can't use that textbook because it's too challenging. So the materials choices, if they're optional, can play into a different level of rigor. And I know with a literacy adoption, we know some schools got the full set of level readers, and some are making it up as they go along. How do you deal with that going forward if you're trying to build a system with equity? Is the MAP testing timing adjusted to that flexibility around 20 days plus or minus for this lesson, so that it happens at an appropriate time in terms of when the material is covered? Those are all questions that are bumping around my brain, and if there's one of those that feels like it's appropriate to answer now as opposed to later as we continue this discussion, that's great.
So I was just going to suggest that there might be some other ways that we could provide more depth. For those of you who are interested, I'm not sure every single board member needs the depth of information that some of you are asking. Yeah, I think we won't be able to get through this presentation and at least share something with you about the assessment framework. The questions all of you are asking are all questions we have raised and we live with every single day. So what I can tell you is the materials are useful. They're in people's hands. They're good literature. We have a lot of other supports to put in for them. We plan to do that. We will have some requests at budget time. We've already talked about it as a whole SLT. But I would like to have us at least go through the overviews, acknowledging that there's a lot of details. It's really hard in this setting to get into that kind of stuff, especially because some of you might want it, some of you don't need that depth. All the questions you're asking are the kinds of questions we work with educators about. So in a board session, we can't meet all of those needs. So we would be happy to invite you in for sessions to have more discussions where we can talk about components, we can share which schools have what we're doing to support them if they don't have what they need, and why we will continue to have more budget requests till we completely fill out what our teachers need.
Yeah, it's a challenge to me as a board member as we go through this to figure out, as a board member, what's my,
Right.
what do I need to know?
Yep.
What's beyond my role as a board member going forward? I don't have a handle on
Right.
but I think all of us are naturally curious about this
Mhm.
and might go beyond what our board role is. And I don't want to create a lot of extra
Well, when
work
we get
for
into
you in that
curriculum
sense.
and programs and content, the board's role is mostly to learn. There isn't anything we're asking right now that we're asking you to weigh in on. But we're just trying to provide you some background information, some information about how the work keeps changing as we learn more information. Our interest is absolutely being collaborative with our staff in the building because they're all in different places. They all need different things, just as our students do. So we know how to do that. So we will continue to do that. We will ask for budget, and we will present a case for you about what we need. The ask is huge. We couldn't do it all at one time anyway, given the staff we have and everything that's already on teachers' plates. Because the other thing we're always cognizant of is how much teachers are doing at the same time. So we want to stand ready to have the support ready and support them. But we have to be careful and provide what's helpful, and that doesn't bury people, right? Both administrators and teachers. So it is a process. It's not going to get taken care of in 1 year, right? This is a journey that we're on. And we will provide some more information around budgeting that looks more like here's a 5-year strategy. We just haven't been together long enough to dig down to that and provide that for you. So
And
if you can.
I appreciate that it's still, y'all been here a couple months.
Well, especially as a team, we're still adding people, so
Yeah.
we kind of have to start the consensus all over again. Where are we? What do we need? What's my job? What's the best way to support? And it's constantly iterative. So I appreciate that you all want to understand that, but in board meetings or work sessions, we won't get to that level of detail. But we're happy to give you opportunities with that level of detail anytime you want it, so we can set those up.
So I actually find this framework pretty straightforward as a beginning framework. And I guess I would say, while our job is primarily to learn, there's certainly policy implications related to this. So it may be the staff's picking the curriculum, but the question of should we be asking the question, do we need to be providing additional days or times so that you can it's viable to be able to deliver the curriculum. So I think there's, at its base, probably some policy questions.
Absolutely. If we're talking about more instructional time, I will say yes every time.
And then the other issue, and I don't have the answer now because I need to learn more, but the fundamental question when students aren't progressing and parents are asking us, so what are you doing to help, my child? I think we need to be able to articulate what strategies at a high level and maybe even be the translator between all of this to parents and community members about how the district is realigning to better support students. But I think for me, that's would be most helpful is understanding it enough so that you can then both ask the right questions and make the right decisions as a board member, but also then to translate things. Because to me, I'm going to leave here without the knowledge of, and I know this is a longer conversation, but so how the different tiers of support layer on top. So I get kind of a general sense now about the 85% of the kids that you're trying to reach, but then how's this other piece layer in, and how do you know that's happening, or the resources that are there, or it's being delivered?
So that's in the
You don't need to-
MTSS model, which
Right, you don't need to
we'll
answer
also
now. I'm
share
just
with
saying,
you, but not tonight.
Those are the types of things that I think would be helpful to be able to articulate in just plain,
Right.
Scott's point, in plain English to the
And that's why we have to come back multiple times, because there's
Right.
multiple parts to
But
this.
that's just what I said earlier, that I think we just have to be careful about putting all of the emphasis on core. It's really, you have to think of it vertically as the system, because not all kids are going to be served in core. So it would be helpful to come back with, here's what core looks like, and here's what we're thinking, and how we're building out the system.
And I think you've done a good job with that as a base.
Yeah.
It's to me, that's the next phase of learning, is understanding that second and third steps.
And I think, go ahead. Well, and I would also ask of you all, I mean, I agree with what you said, Dr. Curtis, about the complexity of this and our role, but I would also ask of staff to just consider that we are always trying to look at, you know, a variety of levers that ultimately end up as budget decisions for how to really serve our students and especially address the inequities in our system. And obviously you are all looking at that all day, every day as well. But when it comes down to limited resources, there are different ways to invest. And so we need to be able to have a sense of, okay, well, you know, with the new expectations and the new protocols around a guaranteed and viable curriculum, you know, how much of a difference is that going to make for our historically underserved students, and how, you know, what's that really going to translate, what's that really likely to translate to in terms of improved student outcomes, or what are the other levers that we need to be pushing at the same time, and to what extent. And so I guess what I'm asking is just for none of us to get too siloed in these conversations. And I'm not saying you are. This is what we asked for exactly, and this is what you're bringing us, because we have the responsibility of kind of integrating all of those needs to get the full picture that we're all looking for, as do you.
And we want to provide you that information so we can come back every work session if that's, you know, helpful. So we just need to know what.
What are the pieces?
Yeah.
So I, listening intently, appreciate the broad range of questions that the board is asking. It's demonstrating long overdue attention on the academic agenda of the school district, clearly motivated, as it is for us, around how do we produce equitable educational outcomes for our students. I believe that's all of our stakeholders, our families, our teachers, everybody's desired objective. Tonight was intended to give you an overview, as was stated in the objectives, around the components of a core curriculum. Our staff was prepared to kind of walk you through how those units are constructed, the work that's happened over the last. Tonight, by the way, is Luis' 1-year anniversary here in PPS. And everyone in the department practically has come at some point, either right before or right after his arrival. It's represented a monumental task to identify the instructional guidance that our educators deserve, and with their support, to develop by teachers for teachers some widely understood units that could guide instruction K-12 across all content areas. That is work that takes up to a decade to get through an entire sequence across content areas. And I'm hearing in the range of questions already thinking ahead around what are the material costs, what kind of professional development does that require? Are principals equipped to provide thoughtful coaching and feedback to our teachers? How are we expanding the professional learning catalog? How are we publishing that? Do we have enough time for it? These are all the right questions and things that we're also thinking about, and we won't have the answers by ourselves because we have to continue to engage with those folks that are in our classrooms who are delivering the instructional core. But tonight, what we were hoping to give you is, because there's been a lot of questions around what's GVC. That's a big acronym, and it represents a lot of work. And so this was just an initial installment. I'm glad that there's interest, and we definitely want to go deep in this topic. Our goal will to make sure that every board member is well versed, so that what we really need out of all of this is a very simple and elegant shared expectation and definition for what we should expect to see when we're standing at a classroom door. And so there's some basic components around sort of what we mean by rigor and evidence of purposeful planning, and things that all our professional practitioners, I think, understand and deserve to be supported, both materially and in advancing their thinking as a community of practice. So that's sort of what we were hoping for tonight, is to kind of give you a sense of some of the work and how it's been organized and how that's beginning to roll out, which is going to be a process. It's not something that we can say after these 10 PD days, pencils down, everybody will know exactly what to do. Because components of a core curriculum are both curriculum, our instructional pedagogy, our assessment, and more importantly, our continuous improvement cycles, which I think they were intending to talk about there in the improvement science work. So I just wanted to kind of like check us at this point, because I know they've been very much wanting to share the work that's been going on, but it's going to be continual work in progress, and we'll continue to sort of invite and make opportunities for personal walkthroughs, so we can have these conversations in a live building with teachers, so we can continue to grow our understanding of what this all means for our students, especially those who we haven't served well, that we know we have to differentiate for, but in the absence of a core, there's nothing to differentiate. And so there's the challenge. How do we make sure we also will have the tools and all the appropriate supports and interventions to make sure all of our students and teachers have the supports they need? And that starts with us at a central level to make sure and define what that framework is. And this is just a part of it. So can we have staff kind of just wrap up the remaining slides? And then I know we've all been noting the questions that have been getting asked, and at the next installment and opportunity, we'll revisit sort of some of those bigger areas that were called out, if that's okay with the board.
So the remaining 5 or 6 slides actually take us into one of the direct aspects of the literacy development, which is the EBBL. And I know there will be a number of questions. Director Esparza, we'll have which is fine, which is great. I mean, we have to put those out there, because for a long time we've just made, those of us coming, we've just made assumptions that it's okay to move in that direction, and we haven't actually challenged the thinking, right? And so if we're going to challenge the thinking, once we put it out there, then it'll help us make better decisions, and just assume that we should continue moving forward. But you raised the question, and you could, and so we'll continue to move forward with the presentation.
So do you want me to move past this slide?
No.
All right.
There.
So as you know, we do as a district have a high priority and focus around supporting all of our students, including our students who have a diverse cultural and linguistic background, that all of our students deserve to have rich literacy experiences that are honored and expanded through responsive and personalized instruction. And so we're working with our teachers, our communities, and our families to build upon the assets that our students bring to the table to make sure that those are cultivated in the classroom and the instructional design. And so a lot of our supports are really focused, and that's why I talk about the Portland GVC. So we have GVCs across the country, but Portland is paying special attention to this area.
Which it might be helpful to
Mhm.
talk about that, and that it's Marzano's framework, because that wasn't, so just for the understanding. But
Yes, and so we will go more into the theories in our ongoing presentations.
it's not just,
Yes.
it wasn't made up for
No, yes.
creating.
The EBBL design emphasizes a scaffolded approach, which means that we're actually providing ways for students to process the information that is meaningful for them, that is relevant. So as I talked about, we're going to chunk the learning for our principals, so we're not giving everything to them all at once. We're starting with the written curriculum, even though when we talk about our GVC, we're talking about the written curriculum, which are the standards, the way that it's taught as it's delivered, and then how do we assess in terms of how do we know that our students have learned what we wanted them to learn. So we're using a variety of different strategies to make sure that our students are learning what they need to learn. When we talk about a gradual release approach, we often talk or describe that as I do, so the teacher is modeling. We provide that guided practice, and then we turn it over for independent practice through in reading, writing, and opportunities for students to interact with a variety of text. This is just a visual graphic of the different literacy components that our teachers are developing in their classroom, and so you heard the reference around reading workshop, writing workshop, word study. And so when we think about these elements, what does the best practice around each of those components look like? And so there's some in this graphic design in terms of foundational best practices that work with all students. So keeping our racial equity work at the center of how we create quality interactions for students with culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Working from an asset-based approach so that we're really building on the strengths of our students and tying those into the instructional design. The teacher is the decision maker, and so they should be thinking about how to design instruction from a student's frame of reference. And again, attuning to the content standards that have been mapped out for them in the scope and sequence of the GBC. We talked about gradual release already, and making sure that it's a culturally responsive classroom. And so when we talk about responsiveness, that's where we get into the assessment conversation, which you'll hear about from Dr. Davis in a moment. But those are the elements of our EBBL literacy system. It is a biliteracy system, so we have that in all of our programs across our schools, even our DLI schools, our dual language schools. And we continue to work and develop each of those elements with all of our classroom teachers. So we have committees of teachers who come and work alongside our content area specialists at the central office to begin to continue to develop and revise our content area work. So that, I think, is the last slide. Oh, wait. Yep. So
I do want to ask, since there is so much interest in the GBC, and a number of people in the community have asked me about this, why can people not see the curriculum?
The curriculum is available on our website.
At what level? Because I'm hearing
Well,
that they can't actually see what is in the classroom.
Everything that was shared with you this evening is available on the website. And the units, the sample units and the sample lessons are available on pps.net/GVC.
Okay.
And a number of the components are there. There are sample lessons there. There are sample units there. The preparation of the rationale behind it, even the committees that were involved in the development of this work, all of that is available. And there have been requests for that information, and it has been made available to them for people who have asked us in OTL.
So Paul, when you say curriculum, which is, what specifically do people mean?
So some of the instructional materials are still behind the firewall because those instructional materials are covered by copyright. And so student-facing documents that would be going home can be made available, but teacher-facing documents and teacher guides and answer keys and assessments and assessment keys, those live behind the firewall, and they always have, because that's material that needs to stay confidential.
Thank you. That right there is a very useful answer. I appreciate that.
Giving out the test answers.
Can I'm going to say a couple things, and you tell me if I'm right or I'm wrong. So very, very high up. So the advantage of having a guaranteed viable curriculum is that we're going to have a curriculum, because we haven't had one, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. That's an important point. I'm not sure everybody knows that. So PPS hasn't had a curriculum coming out of central office for what, 18 years-ish?
About 20. Yeah.
So I think that last part is important, sort of adjective, in that our teachers, in the absence of a
Right.
centrally supported instructional framework, I'm sure have developed work to deliver to our students.
Right. And, which, you know, and bless you, thank you, but it makes it really hard for new teachers.
Yes.
And their students, because it takes a while to, okay. So,
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I thought you had come to a period.
no, I'm gonna say a couple things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Semicolon.
Okay, period, next bullet point. So the guaranteed, one of the chronic issues in PPS has been vast disparities in educational opportunities made available to students from one school to the next. So part of the point of this, right, is that we're setting a kind of a floor that at minimum every kid in third grade is going to learn X.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay. And the idea that we're setting, that you're kind of divvying up the calendar year, the school year, by unit, and I'm going to put this in the form of a question. Is that going to mitigate the impact of housing instability and student mobility? Is that going to, because one of the things that I've heard for years and years is that students who have housing instability, and there are many, many of them, they'll move from one school to the next, and they miss units.
Yes.
So, you know, by the end of sixth grade, they've missed, you know, half a third grade, half a fourth grade. So is that going to, is this GVC going to mitigate that?
Yes, one of the objectives is to address issues of variance.
Okay.
That depending on where they go to school, how often they move, their education will be disrupted, and then when they enter it, it will be very different than what they've experienced in the past. So it's about bringing consistency in the learning.
Okay. Is there, wait, let me ask a follow-up.
Okay.
Is there any consistency across school districts?
There is for the high school science sequence.
There.
Okay, because we get a lot of students who cross the boundary.
If you're in the state of Oregon, to the degree that there's standardization in the implementation of state standards, then yes. If there's a great deal of independence across school districts, then you will have variance across school systems.
Okay.
Right.
Okay,
and-
I just threw that one in. I'd be happy if we had consistency across our own schools. So, you know, okay, I'm good. Go ahead.
And I did just want to add some urgency to the question, because unique among large cities, it's my understanding, an unsupported move by a child from one school to another doesn't hold that child back 6 months, which is the national standard. In Portland, it holds them back a year. And we have many, many, many children who are making a dozen moves over the course of their school career. Their entire career just evaporates right there. So yes, we do need to take this extraordinarily seriously.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so some of the other issues that I've heard a lot about from teachers is that the rollout has been a little bumpy in places, and it's been inconsistent across schools, which is a little surprising if one of the points of all of this is consistency. So can you talk to us a little bit about kind of how it's been, any lessons that you've learned, how are we going to do this moving forward, that kind of stuff.
I'll be honest, from the spring forward, one of the challenges was, for us as a team, was to meet the expected deadlines of having initial drafts of some of these. And the pace was quite rapid. And one of the things that we did not have, honestly, on the front end was learning time together before we began to develop and implement, with not enough staff to begin with, and then the degrees of understanding of what the GVC was. And in some ways, as a district, we still grapple with defining what a GVC actually is, because we're still we're in that learning phase. And so that was one that actually led to an acceleration that was very difficult to meet. And so the result was that as we began to roll some of this and we made this content available online or in our professional development, there were inconsistencies in some of this content, right? Especially because we were looking at math, at language arts, math, and science at the same time. And when you juxtapose them, there was some variance in the consistency. Because one of the things we want to do is to be consistent so that teachers see consistency across the subject areas and not have to rethink across subject areas, right? Or even across grade levels that much. Well, we weren't as successful as we would have liked in that. So as we iterate, we have to pay attention to that. Then when it came to the professional development, part of what happened over the summer was not knowing whether we were going to have a budget to provide professional development in preparation for the opening of the school year. So we were not able to offer one at the end of the year, but then had to wait we did, but not as big as we thought. We did it at Roosevelt High School, which was great, but there were issues. Suzanne was there. You were there. I mean, it was an effort. At Roosevelt. Yeah, it was the EBL one. Not the GVC training. No, well, and that's where understanding EBBL sits inside of GVC. Right. It's the elementary component of GVC, right. So it's in there. So that was the focus. And so then in the fall, we did it again. But that one was smaller, and we didn't have every teacher attend. So then the expectation was, let's begin to implement, but we had teachers who had gone to the training twice, and some who had none. So for us, there was a consistency in the way that we lent support there. So that's the other thing we have to be mindful of and address, how we provide the professional development to make sure that all of the teachers have the understanding they need to begin to implement.
And
so that was also a lesson. And
we
then
need to attend to give you the resources to provide that.
right. And so then the third piece is the resources, and being able to have the resources to be able to do that. So those are the lessons. So we've learned a lot, a great deal. And so with that, and a lot of new people on the team, the positive of that is that they bring great ideas on how we address some of those things because they've experienced it in their own environments, right, and have been successful in doing that. The challenge there is that same thing. We come from various places with various ideas, and we have to gel and then have a common understanding of what that work is, and that's for us to figure out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For the hard work, and I can see where this is going.
Thank you. Okay. So the second part of our presentation is the assessment framework, which will generate conversation and lots of questions, we know. So now we know, we're sort of calibrated and understanding our discourse. And so Dr. Sarah Davis will be sharing with how the assessment framework is designed to capture how we look at not only our practice, but the results of that practice in measuring how students are performing over time, and how it aligns with the assessment framework that was actually drafted inside the school district a few years ago. And so we dusted it off, and we are bringing it forward and implementing our assessment instruments or processes inside of that framework.
Great.
So you guys have been sitting for 2.5 hours, and health and PE is also in my portfolio. So we're going to take 20 seconds and stand up, please. Yeah, and it's getting, so I promise you're not going to have to shake hands or anything, but if folks would stand up, roll your shoulders back, roll your shoulders forward. Gonna do a big inhale and a big exhale.
Thank you very much. That's good.
Okay. Much better.
You can tell she's a teacher.
Okay, so here we go. Let's see if I can figure out the interface now. Ooh. Can you rub your head me and pat your head? No? Okay. So the objectives of this part of the presentation is to really kind of just do a very quick hit on assessment research and its impact. I'd like to show you guys the assessment framework and talk about its development. And then we're going to review some of the district assessments, and then I'm hoping that if I talk fast enough in the beginning part that we'll have some opportunity to actually get hands-on with some data and actually do a data exploration protocol so that you guys can kind of see some of the ways that we can dive into the data. But if we're working to grow our data literacy as a district, then this is a place that we need to do that as well.
Okay, so yeah, maybe
That's what we
let's
consider a
try to
treat.
hold questions.
Okay. So Black and Williams and Hattie have both done very large overarching literature reviews on research and education. And what it can be summed up in kind of 3 very big statements. 1, formative assessments, one of the most effective educational practices when it comes to improving academic achievement. Formative assessments are those little things that you do as you walk around the classroom, looking over kids' shoulders, interpreting if a kid's looking left and right and blank, to, fist to 5, who understands, or having kids explain strategies. And in those strategies, you start to see what are the things they're most comfortable with and what are the things that they're not grasping. And so like an example for mathematics, if you ask students to create something that equals 4 and everybody does addition, and nobody does negative numbers, you can kind of have a feeling that maybe they don't really feel comfortable with negative numbers yet, maybe we need to spend more time with that. But it's these in-process activities that give you insight into what the students know. Formative assessments helps all students and gives particularly good results with low achievers. And the single most powerful modification that enhances achievement is feedback. And so this is what our assessment framework was situated in, that a balanced assessment system really relies heavily on formative assessment and is balanced in terms of interim and summative assessments. So our framework development goals, we wanted to co-construct an assessment framework. We wanted to have common agreements as a system to provide culturally responsive feedback to students, and we wanted to develop a multi-year implementation plan. And so here are the steps that we went through. So at first, in 2014, there was an advisory council that was formed, and it developed very high-level guiding principles for assessment. What do we think assessments should do in the district, but at a high level? Then, much like we did with the GVC, if you know where you want to be, you also need to know what that's going to look like if it's done well. And so we created a rubric for if we are going to create an assessment framework, what are the key elements that that assessment framework needs to have so that we know that it's a good framework. Then the next portion of it was we worked together. There were over 30 educators, 50% of the group was school staff, central office, building-based, and we drafted a K-12 quality assessment framework. We then applied that rubric that had been created to see had we actually hit all of the big landmarks of a quality framework. And then we did some feedback and revisions, and then finally in June, July of the school year before last, we did final comments and revisions, and this assessment framework was released onto the website. Included in your packet that was sent to you previously is a copy of the instructional framework. It's about 22 pages long. So we worked really hard to have it, we worked really hard to have it be accessible, user-friendly, and something that was not such a thick research tome that you'd never get past the second page. And it really talked about this idea of having a balanced system of assessments, and that assessments should be used to inform instructional decisions. Assessments should encourage students to try to learn. It's one of the things that we get so focused on assessments as being a summative thing that we actually forget, like, if you're playing soccer and you're trying to headbutt the ball into the goal, you're gonna miss a whole lot. And then when you finally hit it into the goal, there's your formative assessment, there's your ideas of what you're doing. But as a student, you need to know what personal success looks like. You need to be part of that process of really engaging in how are assessments going to help me learn? How am I gonna know when I really own the information? Assessments should be accurate. It should be accurate information about student learning. It should be useful at several levels of decision making. So we need assessments to inform the classroom, but we also need information like at the system level. If, in some of the data we look at later, we're gonna see that in algebra, we have system-wide struggling in certain topic areas. So as a system, we can then use that information to say, we need to explore additional supports for that topic. We need to explore professional development for that topic. We need to look at our instructional materials for that topic. And so in addition to informing the in-the-moment classroom decisions, we also need data that can help us inform our district level decisions. And then assessment really needs to be mindful of the emotional dynamics of the assessment experience from the learner's point of view. And that's where really engaging students in understanding that assessment is helping us know what they know and what they still need to learn, and not just about, here's the roadblock at your end of your career and you pass or you don't pass. And so this graphic kind of represents the time, and I'm sorry, it got a little wonky. I went from a widescreen to a 3x4, and I missed this one. So the mathematician in me is really unhappy that the N and the G from learning is on the next line, but I'm going to let that go. And so the bar around the outside is representing kind of the amount of time that should be spent on summative assessments, that is in fact the smallest amount of time that you're spending. The next bar in is talking about interim or periodic assessments, and so those will be your next band, and so it's a little wider. But then core at the center is this idea that the majority of your assessment time should actually be formative assessment, really deeply informing instruction to enhance student learning. And then there is this interaction between the standards, the assessment for learning, culturally relevant instruction, and our instructional materials. And that the standards are what we want students to learn, assessments are what that learning is going to look like, and instruction is how we get there and how we span the gap. And then we need data to inform our instruction, because if we don't know how the students are doing, we don't know if our instruction is working. And so as an overview, the framework talked about the assessment purpose, and so it really went into why do we need assessment and how do we use it. It talked about high quality assessments, and so what were some exemplars of high quality assessment and how do those show up. The framework then talked about assessment practices that support all students. And then it also talked about reporting and communication. Assessment shouldn't be a black box. It shouldn't be data in and, hee-hee. We've got answers, you don't. And so really looking at if we are having a balanced assessment system, if we are gathering data, if we are informing instruction, then we need to be reporting that back out at a number of levels of the system. And then finally, if we are going to have good data, we also have to have people who understand how to use that data and to really grow that assessment literacy and competency, again, at all levels of the system, so that data or assessments that are meant to inform one thing aren't being used for purposes that the data themselves weren't meant for. And so after we created this document, we talked with the group and we said, if this is where we want to be, if this framework is describing this perfect state, and we look at where we are now, what are some key recommendations that need to happen? And so we've defined a balanced assessment system, but what it really highlighted was that that we had some significant gaps in that balanced assessment system, that this was in fact a growth area for the district. And so we started doing an inventory of our current assessments, and we found we had a high level of participation for screeners for early literacy, fluency, and vocabulary, but our assessments weren't aligned to standards. Yes, sir?
Screeners for.
Thank you. I've been living this for the past week, so these were all somewhat even newer to me a couple of weeks ago, so forgive me for buying into the buzzwords. So certain assessments are screeners that are given up front that are used to kind of indicate if there are problems that we need to dive deeper into and explore. And so in terms of like our DIBELS and our Easy CBM, those are kind of screeners to give us ideas of where our students are and what's going on. And so we actually have some fairly high participation in the use of those particular screeners.
Also be used for the mandate that that's coming down the pike in next fall, dyslexia screening.
Yes, yep.
Which
Yep.
is, a policy, it's a law that we're gonna have to address.
Yep.
So that'll be helpful to hear at some point.
And so what it also highlighted was that the current assessments being used in the district were not aligned to the standards, not to Common Core, not to NGSS, not to the new health standards, not to the new PE standards. And that we had no common assessment for mathematics across the district outside of the 6th grade performance assessment for compacted math. I mean, that truly is the only district-wide mathematics assessment that existed. And so kind of situating that within the work in progress with the creation. Yes, yep.
So the no common math assessments, is that just, is the emphasis on the no common? I mean, I'm assuming, like we had standards, report cards in math that had, I mean, my kids who were in different middle schools, for example, had, they were in 3 different middle schools, had math assessments that was based the same standards, the standards-based report card. So is it that they weren't common all across the district?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah, so in the same way that Easy CBM and DIBELS were given pretty consistently across all of our schools, and data could be looked at a number of different levels of the system, there was not a similar common assessment across the schools for mathematics. Okay.
So, I'm sorry, just to follow up. So, some schools had it, or they had different ones. There was a decision to go to something entirely different, or that was a better practice than to go to one of the standard-based report card, standard-based systems we already had?
So I can speak most clearly about mathematics. For math, we had pacing guides, and we had information that was very strongly tied to the Bridges instructional materials. We had also a number of schools that, because our adopted version of Bridges was not aligned to Common Core, but we had done that alignment in collaboration with the publisher, and there were additional materials that brought it into compliance. But a number of schools felt that kind of that type of Frankenstein kind of curriculum, they didn't want to do that, and so a number of schools were using Engage New York. A number of schools were using instructional materials from NCTM, and they were taking their scope and sequence from their instructional materials. Still standards-based, still lots of opportunity for amazingly high-quality instruction, but if I'm doing things in the sequence of the Bridges curriculum and you're doing instruction in the sequence of Engage New York, and somebody else is just starting from the Common Core documents and pulling random instructional materials, then there are assessments embedded in that, but there's no meaningful way to look and to have PLCs and to talk about where the gaps are and where additional instruction needs to be focused. And so though the report cards do have the standards listed on them, there is no assumption from the old system of sequence and also rigor and depth of knowledge that all students will have access to across the system. And so the Engage New York assessments were standards-based. The Bridges assessments are standards-based. Other assessments that were being created were standards-based. But that commonality across the system and that ability to do that system-level analysis didn't exist. So in terms, we have the scope and sequence documents as articulated in the Guaranteed and Viable Curriculum. We have some common assessments embedded in those, and as we move toward next year and the full implementation of the Guaranteed and Viable Curriculum, we're looking to have those common assessments done, and so those would be kind of your unit assessments. And so kind of in terms of thinking of a balanced assessment system with mathematics, since the MAPS assessment, which I'll talk about in a second, helped us kind of see conceptual understanding, we needed some assessments that really focus on the practice standards. And so for mathematics especially, the common assessments that have been created at each grade level are performance tasks and very much focus on students' problem-solving ability, persevering to answer questions, looking for patterns, things that don't show up as readily in an adaptive assessment. But we need additional data to inform instruction and the development of program supports. And so we then had to look at how do we get that data. And so that's where the MAP growth assessment comes in. It is an interim assessment, and as is also a formative assessment. And so that's one of the things people talk about formative assessments, and formative really has to do with how the data is used. And so if you're really using that data to inform instruction, it is a formative assessment. Interim refers much more to the frequency with which it's given. And so for the MAP growth assessment, it being an interim assessment is because it's being given, the MAP growth is given 3 times a year, but it is formative because as we are rolling this out, the key focus of this is to inform instruction. And I don't have slides in here. I know we had talked about it previously, but I can also give you the breakdown. There was an extensive process engaging with stakeholders across the system to really explore the adoption of an adaptive assessment for mathematics. And the MAP growth is where we resolved at the end of that process. And so what I want to switch to now, because I know that there have been a lot of kind of questions out there to kind of talking about how this initial rollout of the MAP assessment happened. But again, one of the reasons that we really focused on math for this rollout of this true common assessment, math is our highest failure rate in the district. At the high school level, we have a 22% failure rate for algebra. And that's highly problematic. Math is also our lowest SBAC, so our lowest scores in terms of state assessments. And as I talked about from the work that the assessment committee did, there was no common assessment across all schools for mathematics. And so that's why we move forward really focusing on mathematics.
Just a question. What does MAP stand for?
Measure of Achievement and Progress.
I thought it was measures of academic progress.
That sounds better.
So
Thank you.
It's MAP assessment.
Is that like a branded something, or is it just like?
Yes, it is. And so it's
Measure
from
of academic-
NWEA, which is a assessment organization, and so that we work with. And so the challenge that we were really faced with was to know what students are ready to learn and to maximize that growth for all students. And so the solution that was settled upon was an adaptive assessment. It's unique to each student. With our partnership with NWEA, it's powered by over 40 years of academic research, and the data that it gives is immediate and actionable so that it can be turned around to be used in classrooms. Because a number of assessments have kind of come in and gone out of the district, like our title schools would get something, or this cluster would get something, or these schools would get something, there has been low confidence that things would actually really be here and that there would be buy-in and we would move forward. And that's why when we put forward the contract to the board for the MAP assessment, that we actually asked for you guys to approve a 5-year contract. And I know that with our contracts and everything else, you know, we still have flexibility as a district, but we really wanted to make that powerful statement that we are investing in a 5-year contract. And when information about the assessment was shared to building principals and to our teachers, it was shared with a 5-year vision for the rollout of the assessment, so that it was really understood that there was intentionality, that we are going to grow in our understanding and use of this assessment. And so for year 1, our goal is successful implementation. We've made it through the first assessment window. It has actually there have been some frustrations in certain levels, but you know we've assessed close to 36,000 students. And had, you know, our largest technical support problem was logging in issues. And so, which isn't to say that there weren't other frustrations at sites and stuff like that, but we are on our way. We've had our first window. We've got 2 more windows this year. We're learning from the problems of the first window. We actually have data to look and see, oh, hey, we think, you know, this school's having more technical problems than other schools. We need to have tech support there when they start doing the second window. This school has a really high number of students taking over 50 minutes. How can we go in and support them to really help that go more fluidly? And we have the data. For year 2, we want to deepen that data literacy. So we're working with teachers this year to start to understand the basic reports and to how to use the data. Next year, we will continue that professional learning. In year 3, we're going to expand in all of our schools to K-12. And then year 4, we're going to use it for goal setting. And so really focusing on having students take ownership of here's where I'm starting the year. What do I want to have my goal as a student be for my growth in terms of the winter and then the spring assessments. And then by year 5, we're really hoping that this is going to be fully embedded in practice, that schools will be using this to set school level goals, and that it is just a regular part of our instructional practices here within the district. And so then some stories from the field. So from a 2nd grade teacher at Woodmere Elementary, she talked about that MAP's been really helpful in identifying areas of weakness and strength for students, each of my students in my class. And so being able to use that to structure instruction. Another teacher at Woodmere said the kids knew that their brains were growing and that the test was a visible way for them to see their growth. And so she had experience using the MAP assessment from her school in Chicago and was excited to be seeing that coming here to Portland Public Schools. One of our principals was talking about they did a preliminary data dive during the staff meeting as part of the work on instructional and database decision making, and that it was really great to have something that all of the teachers could really have common conversations around. And finally from Hayhurst, and I've got a formatting issue, we were able to use the MAP data to set school-wide goals for something that I hope is really, really important. And hopefully it's on your printout. But from both teacher and principal perspectives, just kind of this excitement. And then from our schools that chose to pilot the MAP assessment for reading as well, we've had feedback from a number of principals of how exciting it is to have data across reading and mathematics that's in the same format that is easy to focus on and talk about. And so then how did we support that in terms of professional learning? We did 84 on-site sessions to discuss the purpose of MAP growth as an interim assessment and to review the basics for managing the MAP test sessions. We have done custom sessions for principals at convocation. We've done custom sessions with TOSAs, with high school algebra teachers, and nearly 25 of the NWEA and PPS staff were out directly supporting schools for that very first assessment window to really make sure we were understanding how to make it go smoothly moving forward. Building internal capacity, so there have been video tutorials presentations at leadership institutes, dedicated sessions for DLI, special education, MTSS, and then we've brought in different subject matter experts to even talk about deeper integration. We've continued to have office hours with building administrators, going to area meetings, meeting with principals there, and then we've done full day professional learning with all of our OTL TOSAs, so across all of the different content areas, so that we could grow that data literacy, even if you weren't directly working with mathematics or language arts. And then finally, to start building that data literacy, we've done 55 on-site sessions to introduce map growth data and to increase data literacy for using map to inform instruction. And we did that by, so if a school had like 2 strands at 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, we embedded 2 substitutes in the school for the day and then rotated teachers out for 90 minutes at each of the grade levels where map was being done, so that people weren't having to drive into central office and lose a whole lot of time. And they were also able to meet with their grade level peers to kind of start to have that shared data literacy. NWEA provided us this continuum, and it's got a lot of words, and what I'm going to say is that we're beginning, and that's right where we should be, having completed the first session of implementation. We're beginning. We're growing our capacity to lead this work, and our teachers in school, they're at the beginning. They're growing their capacity to understand the data and move forward together. And so I did well with my speed talking, and you guys did amazingly well with not answering questions or asking questions. Sorry. So let's play with the data and let's get into some of the questions. But so just kind of like at a high level, there were 36,000 individual assessment results. We had 24,000 in mathematics, and we had close to 12,000 schools that opted in to do the pilot of the reading assessment. And so that's a pretty significant number. But what I'd really like to do now is kind of dig into the data, and I'm going to put it up on the screen, but I wanted to also share with you guys so that you can see it up close. You're going to want your reading glasses. I know I wanted mine. There we go. And so we're looking at algebra. I figure if algebra is our highest failure rate in the district, that let's look at what the data for algebra is looking like. And so to kind of do part of data literacy is knowing what the format of the graphic is showing us. So at a high level, green good, red bad. So if we can all be comfortable with the green good, red bad, we're like halfway to reading this representation of the data. Gray means we're somewhere in the middle. The farther a topic is to the left means the more fundamental or easier in an instructional program, so think like 3rd grade, 4th grade, those sorts of things. The farther to the right, the more advanced of a topic it is. The longer the bar, it is a topic that spans multiple years before students hit mastery. And the black bar is showing where our district average is on that topic. Because this is an interim adaptive assessment, students are actually supposed to get 50% of the questions incorrect. Because it keeps giving, it wants to find out what you know, but it also wants to find out what you don't know. And so this is one of the key differences between a summative assessment and an adaptive assessment. And so the map assessment will give you a question. If you get it right, it gives you a harder one. If you get that right, it gives you a harder one. If you get that wrong, it gives you an easier one. And it bounds it until it starts to hone in on where is the zone that you are consistently, like what's exactly the maximum of what you know on that particular topic, and then where are things starting to fall off. And so 50% is actually about where we want to be on any given assessment. And so if students are And then if students are up above 50, so if they're starting to get to 56, 57, that means that as a district, we have a lot of students who are getting those types of questions consistently right all the time on that topic area. And so that starts to indicate some kind of higher levels of mastery. If we're starting to get closer to the 45 zone, 44, 43, 42, that means it's a topic area on which a number of students have actually consistently gotten it incorrect. Yes, ma'am.
So this may be a stupid question, but do the kids know that the answers in a formative?
So that
Getting to know
that
what
was
they do.
part of the professional.
The question was, do the students know if they've gotten something wrong, or is this primarily a tool for the teacher to modify instruction or to know where the students are?
So within the so the assessment itself is trying to gauge where students' knowledge is, and so it's not an intelligent tutor. It's not trying to take a student who got a problem right and get them to getting it incorrect. And so the students are asked to do their best on a problem, and if it is beyond what their knowledge is, to make their best guess and move on. Because that data is then made available to the teachers, to the building, to the district, to then really kind of dig in on what are the topic areas and what are the concepts that the students know, and what are the topics and concepts that they have yet to learn. And so it could even be thought in some, as we develop across the years in using this, it could be done as like a quick pre-assessment. We've just seen on the unit guide that, potentially up to 20 days of instructional time may be spent on a concept. What if the majority of the students in your class already know that concept? Or what if the majority of the students of your class don't have the underlying skills that are necessary to even start learning that concept? And so these are the types of information that this type of assessment can give us. Yes, sir.
So if a child is expected to get half of it wrong, this is going to be a fairly traumatic test for them, isn't it?
But that's why I was asking, but it sounds like they don't know.
So
well,
as, sorry.
in my experience, they do know.
And it's that they will probably not get it all right. They will get half of it wrong.
Yep. And so I'm sorry, I interpreted your question as, do they know as they're taking it which questions they have gotten correct or incorrect? But also as part of setup and as part of the professional learning for doing this assessment, that was part of what was talked about with our educators across the district, was how to set this up so that students knew what was coming. Our two schools that have the highest number of students taking over 90 minutes on the assessment are two of our more higher achieving schools. And one of the things that we were told, that we tried to communicate, that we'll continue to communicate in professional learning as we move forward, is that students who are used to always getting things right have a much harder time of going, okay, I've tried my best, but I don't know this, so I'm going to make my best guess and move on. And they stay with the test trying to figure out and work out every single problem. And so we need to continue that communication of setting our kids up to successfully make it through this assessment, to understand this assessment's really helping them figure out what they already know and what they still need to learn. And there is no harm, no foul if you don't know it yet. That's all that we're trying to figure out, is what do you know and what do you have yet to learn. So with the district level summary that you have in front of you, and so we have kind of the two big algebra topics, what I'd like you guys to do is just kind of take a second, and as you look at this data, to ask yourself, what do you see? And so I'm going to ask you to take a couple of minutes to look at it silently, and then I'll give you a couple of minutes to kind of turn and talk, and then we'll kind of see, like, what are the types of things that we're seeing in this data. And I'm going to now put the question up actually with the representation of the data, so our folks in the, yes.
So.
Yes, sir.
There's the percentage, which you explained what that meant. there's a black bar.
And so that black bar is where we are as a district, and this is across all of our high schools in 9th and 10th grade.
So I'm not sure what the score at the bottom means, because you would think that higher score is better, but we've got some greens that are lower, some reds that are higher.
And so if you think of it in terms of a concept that is farther to the left is an earlier topic, say addition, subtraction, whereas multiplication and division would be slightly more to the right. And so where the actual concept is presented, the one way to think of it is like the farther to the left, the easier the concept, but it's much more in terms of it would come earlier in instruction, and farther to the right is much more advanced and complex. And so that's where these borders are from the left and to the right. The ones to the left also can be seen as kind of much more foundational. And so like one of the things you're noticing is like some of the things are to the left and some are to the right. And if a one on the left is red, that can be highly problematic, because if that's one of the more foundational topics, then that's going to have an implication for those concepts that then build on it. What are other things you guys are noticing or questions?
What does the black line average mean on those bars? If left to right is foundational to higher, what do the bars mean? It appears from your description like you're trying to the graph is trying to communicate two completely different concepts with the same dimension.
Okay. So the black line is where we are as a district. And so if we are closer to like 43%, so on this concept that spans, and so what the numbers at the bottom are in terms of RIT scores, and which is a construct that's it's specific to the organization, and we can get into that more later. But essentially, the lower the RIT score, the more foundational the concept. And so we're talking a concept that spans a broad range, and then as a district, where our students are actually scoring. And so on that one that says 43%, so that is a more foundational concept that has a broad span, and we as a district, our students scored at 43%, which means this is a concept that as a district we are struggling with. See, data literacy, it's not for wimps. We got to dig in. Come on, Director Anthony. Come on, stay with me. It's our first of many.
Okay, but you've got three different topics that are at 52%. So two of them, the algebraic expressions, are more sophisticated or less foundational than number sequences, the 6th or 7th one down.
So what are some other things you guys are noticing?
So
Yes. Oops.
This isn't noticing from the data so much as a question about how does this dovetail with the district's wholesale movement, at least at the high school level, to proficiency-based grading, which one would think that they would marry very well because you are really disaggregating the different content areas. But in my experience, the challenge with proficiency-based grading is that theoretically the student has an opportunity to, continually keep trying to meet a particular target. However, instruction marches on and new content is introduced all the time, even when the prior foundational content hasn't been mastered. So is there Is that too weedy, or is there anything you can say about how those two processes
So
interact?
they do dovetail really brilliantly. And as we put together our official processes for proficiency-based grading at the high schools, this needs to be a deep part of the conversation, and we need to really dig deep and figure out how is it going to fit. Where is it going to slot in? Is it going to be something that we decide as a system that we're going to allow to be an indicator of proficiency? Or as we dig into the data, do we feel, this gives us an indicator that the student's on the trajectory, but we don't feel comfortable having this be an indicator of proficiency. We're going to need to dig deeper and have some other protocols and systems in place. And so how it dovetails is that, that has to be a part of the system. We have a new data source that we haven't had previously. And so how do we use it, but use it well? And those are the things we really need to dig in and work on together as a system.
And I guess it gives you the baseline when the teacher begins a unit of proficiency to have a much better sense of where the students are and how to approach it.
Yep.
So this is just data for PPS?
This is just PPS and just from the very first assessment window. And so it's baseline data.
So what it shows us is our strengths we have like 3 strength areas: linear functions, pattern, sequence, and piecewise absolute.
Or that those are the areas where we're slightly above the national norm. And we have other areas where it's solid gray. We're right where the national norm thinks we are. And we've got a couple of core areas where, Or, and not even that, but it's like, and then as a system, it's like, okay, so now the math team and we need to go dig in and kind of look at where is that following in our scope and sequence? What are the instructional materials that are aligned with that? Have we done professional development on that concept? And so how can we support? And I think it's, and the only reason I want to, because this really is to inform instruction and to help improve the system, and it's not a gotcha. It's just an indicator of where we need to grow as a system.
So, and that was kind of my earlier, this is an offshoot of my earlier question about when the test is given, is it appropriate? Does it match what we've been teaching?
And so because it really works to figure out exactly what a student knows, and it is standards based, and so our instruction's aligned with the standard, but it's not a summative assessment. So it's not looking to see if you learned what was in the unit that we just did. It's looking to actually see how are you growing on these concepts across time. And so it looks to understand what you know. Then as a teacher, you can go, wow, I just did 2 units on scientific notation, and my students haven't shown growth on scientific notation from this window to this window, so maybe I need to dig in deeper. Or, wow, this is the unit that we just covered, and all of them demonstrated exceptional growth, so I think my unit on scientific notation is really strong.
Except that if we're only giving them,
If you're measuring growth, it implies that there was a first test and a second test?
Yes, and so there are 3 assessment windows across the MAP assessment, and so we had an assessment window right at the beginning of the school year. There will be another assessment window in January, and then there will be a final assessment window late in spring toward the end of the school year.
Okay, now, is this an actual result, or is
Yes,
this
that is our baseline data from the very first assessment window.
So how is it a growth if it's a baseline?
My apologies, because you were so after we do the assessment in January, that's when we'll look at growth data. So I apologize. This representation is not currently talking about growth, but when you were asking me about unit assessments and how would it measure how students were doing on different units, it would be in those next assessments that you'd been able to say, so the original assessment was done in January, we're going to do another assessment window, the first one was done in September, our next window is going to be in January, and then you can look at the concepts and topics upon which students have seen growth. And we'll come back with that growth data in January when we have that so that you can see what that looks like.
But it's not going to tell you at the end of a unit how your students did, because it's only quarterly.
Yeah.
So it's
I understand.
So it
that, but
doesn't.
So, if, okay, functions. If the instruction between now and January, or between September and January, functions hadn't been covered,
You wouldn't expect to see growth in that area.
Okay, that's,
So this is really to inform instruction. So for example, just take it from the perspective of a parent. So you may or may not know if this has even happened, right? Because you're not going to get the results, your student's not going to get the results. So the way that you're going to know if your student is, how they're doing in class is by whatever other tests that the teacher is doing.
So
Then gets in synergy, and then you're like, well, they're getting C's or A's or.
So we
So
are
there's-
working to get data into the data dashboard. It is the classroom data is immediately available to the teachers, so that they can use that to structure information. We put together some simple ways to share data with parents at parent-teacher conferences. If folks were interested, again, this baseline data isn't the most interesting data. The really interesting data is going to be after that second window in January when we're really looking at the growth. And so kind of figuring out, when does it fit within the system, and in what ways do we want to make that data visible back to parents? And so for this baseline data, we just did kind of a really simple protocol and just kind of sketching the math and the reading on a piece of paper with some information on where the national norms were, because it is useful data. People kind of talk about, oh, it's the first assessment window, it's not useful. I'm like, no, it's not as interesting, but it's still useful. It gives us baseline data to kind of look at things. And that's part of it. Again, like this year, the goal was to successfully give the assessment. We've got a whole lot of structures we're going to have to figure out and interact with parents and find out, when are the touch points that the data is needed, what are the meaningful ways to share that back, and how we do it. And so we're talking with other districts who have been doing the MAPS assessment. We're interacting with our teachers and we're getting feedback. But this is not a black box assessment that you can never know how you did. It's just kind of figuring out those processes and protocols for how to do it and to do it well.
so, go ahead.
You guys have to help me here. Okay.
I'm spacing out. What did I just was I asking?
Why don't I start again?
Oh, no, so
Yeah.
you talked about an assessment matrix. So when you have, what I have in my head is, like, here's this test that we're using to measure literacy and math, and list out the specific tests, for example. So, like, what would be in the under literacy? What all tests are?
And you would think we would
assessments?
have that, wouldn't you? And we are building it right now. So we are hoping to have that by the end of January, but that is not something that cohesively and thoroughly exists right now. And so we're working on it. That's
Yeah,
a
'cause
great
I think
idea.
It's important to, because I think there was some confusion around some of the progress monitoring tools that
Yeah.
we had used, and that's going to be important going
Yep.
forward, just because of our mandate to address the dyslexia screening and needing to continue that line. So it'd be just helpful for us to know, for example, maybe why we're needing to do certain tests or continue to have them in an assessment
Yes.
matrix because of X.
And we have a team that is covering all of the different departments, and then when we get that matrix together, we're actually also then putting on what are the strengths and weaknesses of the different options that we have, and we're going to be taking that out to teachers, our educators, we're going to be taking it out to building administrators, because things that we see as strengths and weaknesses, say of DIBELS, may be different than the strengths and weaknesses that the people in schools are seeing. But for efficiency, we were starting to populate that matrix centrally, so that we kind of gave the gift of the first draft and got feedback.
That specifically with the dyslexia maps is not on the
You're correct.
state-approved assessments, so we
Yep,
just have to
and so
really
DIBELS at the
watch
kindergarten
that.
level is
Or
still in place.
PZCBM or whatever, but
Yep.
just to think and prevent
Yep,
that. too.
definitely. Yep.
Scott? You forgot to.
No, well, almost. I'm surprised I didn't. So part of your fourth year out is when your goal is to have, across the board, engagement of students in, hey, you just took this assessment, here's your strengths, here's your weaknesses.
And we're phasing that in, kind of the plan is that to start with potentially focus students, and have teachers work with 2 or 3 students in their classes the first year, and then build out to the next year to do it more, because it's a learning process for all of us for how to do that, and to go from 0 to 30, having those goals conferences with students, that's part of the professional development plan, and we would like to ease into it and kind of say, okay, let's start with, let's identify 2 or 3 target students in our class, let's have those goals meeting, let's see how those work, let's revise that plan, and then the following year really look to expanding it out and doing it with all of the students in the classroom. And so at the high level, I did just kind of the big landmarks for each of the 5 years, but we would ease into it. So it's not going to be all the way to year 4 before we start doing those goal setting meetings with students.
So does the 43% on the whole numbers represent and solve word problems, which I'm not sure exactly what that phrase means, except for the last part, solve word problems.
So it's word problems that involve whole numbers, and so one of the things that could indicate is that we've got kids who are struggling with problem solving, that they're strong with the computation. And so if you give them a naked number problem, they can solve it, but when you embed it in a problem situation where they have to dig in and kind of figure out what numbers are important, what numbers do I deal with, which ones do I actually interact with, that might be something that our students are struggling more with. And that wouldn't be surprising, because nationally our students struggle with that more.
So I'm informally talking with I teach a community college course, and talking with others in the higher ed realm. I was working with a student Monday who was taking calculus, who did not know that 1 over 5 equals 20%. And that's in Vancouver, which is supposedly beats the pants off us in educational quality, right? Well, no. And I think my hypothesis is that this is an outcome of we're going for deep understanding at the cost of, all those friggin' times tables that I had to do back in 3rd grade, learning how to do long division.
Philosophical discussion about that.
Yeah, but we're ending up with, I don't know how to solve simple problems, calculating the unemployment rate for the class. That was it's 10 over 50. What is that? Couldn't do it. And they're taking calculus. Yeah, save that for a later day and how we're doing it, but I think that's a huge issue around teaching to the test and not to day-to-day application of math.
Can I just follow up with that? Well, it is and it isn't. Because I think I would love to have a deep philosophical conversation about all these things. Because I think a lot of our questions, a lot of our confusion, a lot of our hesitation is actually grounded in kind of philosophical dilemmas that we're not talking about. It might be worth talking about.
Mm-hmm. We have, as a society.
Not right now. It's 9:15. But at some point, I think.
And key for math is that as a society, we don't believe that everyone can do math. We believe that everyone can read, but we don't believe that everyone can do math.
Maybe it's the way we're teaching math, but anyway.
I would agree with that.
So maybe during the visioning process, maybe we can talk a little bit about educational philosophy and satisfy my desire for philosophical debate there, but.
Could be a table topic.
Yeah, I mean, because, yeah, anyway.
I've got a graduate course I've taught that I could get you the syllabus for.
Okay.
Next fall, I get a new class of kids. Will this information from the third assessment be useful to me? And say if I'm teaching, if they took algebra last year and I'm doing geometry this year, will this be useful for me in terms of assessing their incoming proficiencies and where I might have to do some?
You would have insight as to the strengths that they had at the end of the previous school year, because right now at the high school level, we were only doing the assessment in algebra classrooms. We wanted to get those transitions.
Fifth grade, sixth grade, you know what, would be probably more.
Because at the very beginning of sixth grade, they would be taking the assessment again, and so you'd be able to look at, where were they at the end of fifth grade, where are they now at the beginning of sixth grade, where were their summer slide topics, and then you'd know, like, at the beginning of sixth grade, what are the things that they really know, where are their strengths, what are the things that you can leverage in your instruction to build on. And you would have that data at the individual student level, and you would also have classroom level reports to kind of know as a class. It can also be used to help group students so that you can do heterogeneous grouping for problem-solving types of situations, and you could do homogeneous grouping to do like centers and really do a deep dive, because these are my 5 kids who just cannot figure out how to divide with fractions. And so I can do a focus group with them because I have some additional information on how to work with that.
I did my best soccer coaching when I did that.
Any other questions? We're good. Okay, well, can I go back to an earlier slide before we got into the data? It's the one on the 5-year plan.
Yes, ma'am. Nope.
There we go. Okay, so I just want to ask a few. So, what would qualify as a successful implementation?
The number, like, for our first assessment window, I would say we had a successful implementation of the first assessment window. We have lessons learned, we have things we need to improve, we need to get the numbers of students taking over 90 minutes down, and we need to get this number of students taking over 50 minutes way down. And so across the next 2 windows, a huge indicator of success for me would be getting those time to test numbers way down. And we have data to focus that support. We have some strategies in place, and we're really gonna work with schools that had really high numbers, and we're going to kind of really review with the educators that are on the front lines giving the assessment is, really talk with students about this idea that it's really okay to miss the problem. We want you to try hard. We don't want you just to kind of blow through it and not care. But it's really okay that if I've tried and I just don't get it, I can make my best guess and move on. And so we're hoping that as we can kind of, it's a shift for all of us. Pretty much every other assessment in our system right now is all about getting as many questions right as you can. And so to have something come into the system where it's like, nope, you're going to try really hard, but if you don't know it, make your best guess and move on. Because, as I said before, it's important to know what you know, and it's important to know what learning still needs to take place. That's why you're still in school. There's still more to learn. And so that, for me, would be successful implementation, is to get to the point to kind of lower the pain right now.
Okay. So what was the original plan for how... I'm actually confused about year 1 versus year 3. Year 3 is expand to K-12. So what are we doing now?
So the original plan for mathematics was to start with grades 3 through algebra, focusing on mathematics. But for our title schools, because there are additional data requirements, especially in related to ESSA and the need for a full data management system, for the title schools, they were given the option of implementing it K2 as well. And these were site-based decisions. Some sites may have been more inclusive into making sure it was something that everyone was bought into. Some sites it may have been a little bit more directive from the principal level. That's part of growth as a system. And so it's kind of, we can continue to have conversations. We can continue to work with schools. Is it unfortunate that at a couple of sites it was more of a top-down decision than a collaborative decision? Yep.
So now what? So, I mean, that happened. So first test. So now what? We just gonna, I mean, are those schools gonna power through to test 2 and test 3, or have you put the, I mean, have you backtracked? I mean, what?
So one of the areas of greatest pain was at our DLI schools, where students were did the assessment in both English and Spanish. Research-based best practice says that you actually do want to do that. Maybe not in the first year. Maybe we learn how to do the assessment and get things more efficient. And so what we are going to do for the second assessment window is we're going to ask schools, pick a language. And we're going to collaborate with DLI and with the individual schools so that there is an intelligent protocol for the picking of that language. So in our lower grades, it might be something specific. In our upper grades, it might be the language of greatest proficiency. I'm not saying that's the way it's going to be. I'm just trying to give an exemplar. But we have a little bit of time to kind of say, okay, if we're going to back off, if we're not going to do it in 2 languages, what's the best advice we can give the schools for how to pick the language? Because we don't want to just kind of throw it to them and say, hey, you guys figure it out. So that is going to be one of the things that we do. Do you want to?
So, when in a conversation, in the recent conversation with the PAT leadership, that question came up because there was an understanding that DLI programs had been asked to test in both languages. In continuing to communicate with principals, we cannot find a single principal who has actually done that. And so they were only assessed as far as how we communicated to site administrators, and it has been said by PAT leadership that they were told by teachers that students were in DLI programs were asked to assess in both languages. Since then, Michael Bacon and other people have been communicating with their principals, and as of now, we have not found a principal, and I am hearing that is not true. What I am saying is that we have not been able to identify a principal who has said that they have been assessing in both languages in the K2, in the K2. And that it was in the language of the majority of where the instruction took place, whether it was Spanish, which is the case in our DLI programs.
Wouldn't we know what tests?
Yeah.
We'll be able to pull the data.
We're going to pull it. But this was just a very recent conversation. It was yesterday.
Okay.
So
my understanding, I've heard that the original plan was to, and I may get the grades wrong, but to limit the testing to like 3rd grade.
that was the original.
Up to something. Yep. But some schools did it K through 2 as well?
So title schools are funded programs made available to those schools that they could also do the assessment K2. And that's what I was saying. That was a site-based decision. And as I said, some sites did it inclusively and had it be kind of a collaborative decision that's what we were going to do. And some sites it was a bit more of a top-down decision. And so that's going to be a growth area for us moving forward to kind of like, when we have these situations that it's going to be a site-based decision. kind of how do we have that be more open and collaborative? But that's the reality of what happens. Some schools are doing it from K on and are very happy, and we have a number of reports from title schools that are so excited to be seeing consistent data across the whole school in math and language arts, and that they're very pleased with it. And then we have some other schools that are really unhappy, and all of those are our constituents, and we have to work to find a way to do better moving forward.
So I'm a couple of things concern me. I think one of the problems we've had as a district is kind of offloading decision-making about important things onto onto principals, basically. And I thought we were trying to move away from that. So I'm surprised to hear that there was that much flexibility. And two, and this is verging on philosophical, I got a problem with assessing kindergartners. I got a problem, but I'll let that go for the moment. Not forever, but for the moment.
That's when you know you don't want them to fall behind immediately. I mean, that's the easiest time to pick up those kids that might need a little extra boost there. It's not like they need hours of assessment, and the assessments need to be developmentally, appropriate at the time, but it's also.
Okay, this is verging into philosophy. Kindergarten should not be the new second grade. Kindergarten should be still, free play, and, I worry about, yeah.
Rigor.
Yeah, I worry.
Yes. Mathematics has given economics rigor, alas, but also mortis. Robert Heilbronn.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I was just gonna say, if you had a student, though, in kindergarten who hadn't picked up any of the basic fundamentals and they went into first grade, they're gonna be, it's not having a rigorous kindergarten experience, but it's, if you get.
But do we need a 50-minute assessment to figure out?
Well, I'm not saying that. I think just philosophically, it's worth knowing if your child's heading into first grade totally unprepared and way behind other students. And most times, parents, you don't know what you don't know. I'm not advocating for a.
Not a long.
Kindergarten shouldn't be the new second grade, and first grade shouldn't be the new third grade.
That's fine if you have a child who's reading by third grade. But if they're not, it's too late.
Well, it's not about assessing, it's about a particular assessment that is sitting down at a computer for however many long it is to assess a kid. I don't think you need that long to assess a kindergartner's math skills. Or that you need to do it at a computer. That's the, yeah.
Like I said, developmentally.
So thank you guys.
Providing staff an opportunity to share how this administration has chosen to begin to implement a balanced assessment system, which is our responsibility. And I know that there's a lot of questions here. I know that we're not questioning the role of assessments entirely. But first-year implementation is to help gather input, feedback, learn some lessons, clarify guidance to our school leaders, making sure that we're continuing to provide support, and more importantly, provoking important conversations about what have students learned, what do they still need to learn, and what adjustments do we make in the classroom and at the systems level to provide equitable intervention so everybody's achieving. So that's our responsibility. That's what we're going to keep working at. There are no perfect instruments, but that's the whole point of having a balanced assessment system, that there's a range of those that are used at the classroom level and primarily there to inform instruction, but also to inform the system moves that we're being held accountable for making sure are in place. So we'll look forward to telling you more as this continues to evolve. I have lots of opinions on lots that was mentioned tonight, but I'll reserve those for our conversations as district administration on how we proceed. Thank you.
So, at our next exciting episode, I want to give you a chance. One, I enjoyed your presentation. To give you a chance to amplify on successful implementation, because I'm going to assume it's a lot more than cutting down the time it takes the test. It's also, wow, now we've got 2 sets of data.
Yeah.
Now we're learning our strengths and weaknesses. Now we can.
Yep, definitely.
And we'll be doing our homework about all the hundreds of districts that do use the map successfully across the grade levels to see how they've addressed some of these similar kind of concerns when they first started rolling these out years ago.
Yes, ma'am.
It'd be more shocking if we had no data.
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't know. Oh, sorry.
You didn't know.
We will have a box and whisker discussion. It is one of my favorite representations of data, and I will have coffee hours if anybody wants them. You will love box and whiskers.
What does this chart say to you that we need to do?
I can't see that chart from here. And I don't have the packet.
What's the chart?
It's disaggregated.
So we would like to invite all of you, we know it can't be in more than 3 people at a time, but to come to our offices to have smaller conversations where we can really dig in and answer questions. And if it's a smaller group, then of course it can go wherever that group wants. But this is such a hard format to do that in and to really teach. And we'd love to do that. So we're all saying we'd love to do office hours. We can get a group together. We can talk about MTSS, GVC, EBBL. So we'll work with Roseanne to see what you all would like. In addition to, we would like to come back multiple times to work sessions. Because not only do we have what we know now, but we're learning so much more and doing so much more, so there's always more to talk about.
Did you want to say anything about the disaggregated data, or?
It's shocking.
We're wanting to know, do you want us to answer that right now?
Well, I would be interested in what, like, when you look at this, what does this inform you, what we need to do right away? Because there's huge differences in medians.
Well, in the immediate, our students our students of color are not performing well.
Without exception.
Without
by
exception.
school.
Yep.
Correct.
So this first administration of the map is confirming what summative results and observation have been telling us. And so, once again, it's just underlining that we have a lot of work to understand why that is. And so this is one data point. There's certainly others.
And why we need assessments that give us that drill down data to the skills, so that we can tell district-wide what we do to provide those supports at the district level, or from the district level.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Division 20, right, Division 22. Okay.
So given the time, this is just an update. I know you have it in front of you. I don't intend to read it to you. I can kind of summarize. But our promise to you almost a year ago, when the first meeting I had with you was the Division 22 report and the areas where we were not in compliance. So we have summarized quickly what we are doing to be in compliance and where we will be in compliance. We had talked at agenda setting one time of just providing you the written information and then having you send me questions, and then we decided to put it on a work session. Given the time, I don't know if you would like to do it that way. I think it's short enough to read through and see where your questions are.
Why don't you just start with there's thankfully a couple of areas where we are on track to be back into compliance this year. So why don't you just talk about the couple of areas where you don't expect that we'll be able to get back into compliance?
So one of them we've talked about over and over again, and that's the materials adoption. The library systems, we will be in compliance, but there's a component to what is expected under Division 22 that is aligned with where you are with your curriculum, because the expectation is that you're aligning your materials in your libraries to go with your curriculum. So that is just ongoing work, and as we do new adoptions, we'll have to look at library materials as well. And under the talented and gifted, I think I was a little confused because I didn't have enough information about what we had done and where the TAG Act plan was. So what the state requires is that we meet students' rate and level. And so that is what we're working on right now. I know board members have asked, where are we with the TAG Act plan? And we've kind of done a reset with the new TAG coordinator that we have, TAG director. She's meeting with TAG Act, and right now there are a few priorities they're working on. One of them is moving to ensure universal second grade testing and to improve that identification process and the services for our ELL students and students that are twice exceptional. The other challenging area that always is and has been my entire career is how, what are the assessments you use and how do you identify the historically underserved students? Because we're very under-identified in that area. So that is something that they're taking on with earnest. And so not only have we done the training with every single school on right and level, every school has a TAG plan. There is a facilitator in every school who is responsible for making sure that assessments happen, that rate and level is being met for the students. And I think what you can see in the way that we're responding to all of these speaks to our efforts to be systemic. So just, it's not that some of these things didn't happen before, especially around talented and gifted. It just wasn't consistent, and there wasn't any checking really or any accountability. And then there wasn't the follow-up that we want to provide now, which is that ongoing professional development where teachers have individual students and they need some support with how do I meet the rate and level. If the student's really high, very high above the rest of the kids, it needs it at a really quick pace. They need support around that. Sometimes you need to cluster kids in the building, and so just more professional development for everyone, and that professional development has to be aligned with the GVC professional development because it's tied to those standards. So those are areas that will just be ongoing. I think the rest of them we're on track, and you saw under PE, we won't meet the PE compliance until we're in compliant with the minutes, and then the curriculum work has to be aligned with those minutes. So that'll be the one area where we will just continue to use our current PE adoption, which has been approved by ODE. The other area that we are not in compliance, we have a waiver and we'll ask for an extension this year, is around instructional materials for ELL students, or ESL materials.
Yeah, and I had a quick question about that. Given that there are ELD standards, if the GVC, if you are going to follow that same model of...
So they've done them
including
together and embedded the ELL standards into the core standards. Do you want to speak to that, Mark?
Yes, and
I don't need a lengthy explanation. We can talk about it all.
It's been because again, what I had shared with you about the accelerated pace, the integration. One of the things that happened, and you can imagine, they became in our development an afterthought in the initial iteration. So we had to rethink some of that, and that is where Kimberly and the team are now revisiting that, because the expectation is that they're integrated and not another box. Okay. That's the plan.
And because we do content-based ELD, it has to go along with each of the content areas. However, I can say, just having been in the state for a while, that the adopted program that we're using right now, Avenues, was the recommendation by the state originally until the standards changed. So we're aligned until we can get everything else aligned. But just kind of, I know I'm working backwards now on the page, but just speaking to just making things systemic, the library services, ensuring that we are up to speed with the standards of how we're operating and distributing materials. A lot of that can only be done when it's done centrally, and then we can monitor it. So that is, I think, the major effort was to continue working on our curriculum, continue making sure that we align with one another and that we have system-wide approaches and ways to continue to support with professional development and then to continue monitoring implementation of those. So we will be back with you on January 4th with where we are in compliance for this year, but you already have a preview of what that is. And then on January 22nd, we will come to a work session on the TAG plan. And Linda will be here and Aurora, and they'll talk more about what's in that plan that they've been working with the parent TAG Act group on.
So just remind me, we vote on these? I forget about it.
No, we just come to you and report whether we're compliant or not, where we needed waivers or extensions. And it January 4th, and it's way ahead of schedule because we don't have to have it to them till February 1st, but we just wanted to get it done because we already have the information.
So on the 4th, you'll bring something like this will say, here are the 3 areas, I mean, there'll be 3 areas that are no longer, that we're still not in compliance with?
So yes, and every year ODE tells us what they want us to respond to in Division 22. You may remember last year that I shared with you, teams had worked statewide, superintendents with, to lower the mandating requirements from ODE because there were so many reports they were mandating that, and they weren't looking at them. They weren't giving us any feedback. They weren't monitoring anything. So we said, we would rather you tell us what are the ones you think are most important, are new, that you think most people are not in compliant with, because it was a lot of work, a lot of reporting, and then nothing. And so they had started a new format of like picking 2 or 3 areas and then wanting to go deep into that. Well, then they kind of were reduced in capacity to even monitor that. So the last 2 years, they've just sent a list where you just check off the box, are you compliant or not? We haven't yet gotten a copy of how we have to report it. They said they're working on it and we should have it soon. So what we're intending to do at this point is to use the same check-off list, but we thought it was most important to report where we knew we were not compliant and where we would continue to have, be not in compliant going forward. Because it's the responsibility of the superintendent to make sure we're in compliant or have reported that to the board. So you just need to hear the report, and then the minutes and the agenda just go into our report to ODE.
And then it gets posted on our website by law, I think.
Yeah.
So is acceleration part of core?
In what context?
Well, you said like ELD is part of core, our core instruction. Is acceleration part of core, considered core or not?
Rate and level, is that what you're
Yes.
responding to?
Yes.
Yes, every student should be getting instruction at their rate and level, and that was something I wanted to mention earlier, and we can talk about it more with TAG. But
Yeah.
by using adaptive tests, I've actually seen TAG teachers teach students kind of what the tests give them, and then for students to start using the assessments themselves to see where they can challenge themselves. Actually, Roseanne was just telling me her daughter's doing that right now. She's saying, I love this test because it's telling me what I know and what I don't know. I said, maybe she should do the presentation. But there are many ways to use that data with students so they own their own learning. And of course, we're just at the beginning of it, but I've been in districts where we have used that as a way of helping kids know their rate and level and have them help create extensions for themselves, which oftentimes they can do.
So when we hear about the TAG plan, the accountability piece, so are schools actually integrating rate and level into their instruction, daily instruction? How do we know that? I'd be interested in hearing
Because that is the
along with-
facilitator's job to, what do they call it, a tag? Let me just double check what she called it. Yeah, facilitator. So, first we had to make sure we had one identified and they were actually doing that work. And then we had to go out and provide the professional development. Now their job is to follow up with teachers who have students who are identified as talented and gifted and help them understand when they take assessments, what is it they need? How can they do that? How can they differentiate in their classroom? Or if the teacher says, I need other help, I need other supports, then they have somebody to help, and then the facilitator asks for that help at the district
Is it
level.
the facilitator's job or the principal's job?
Facilitator's job. I mean, the principals have to be backing up that facilitator because a facilitator can't go tell a teacher what to do. They're really the support for that. So it's really a team.
Okay, more to come.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I know we have some public comments.
How long do I get? 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Okay, great. Can I start really quickly?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Hi, my name's Rebecca Levison. Nice to see you. I'm a classroom teacher, an ESL teacher, and also an ESL TOSA. I just want to say, we'll talk about MAP testing. In layman's terms, this is standardized testing gone wild. Seriously. I was trained to go out and help teachers understand the test and also get feedback from them, which I provided to the district and to the NWEA. And the three biggest components that were is that it was not useful for instruction, that it was an incredible loss of instructional time, and I know Elizabeth has more of that information, and also extremely stressful and for kids and for teachers, but really for kids. And I think, Julia, you mentioned it, I think the best. You're operating under these assumptions that teachers have no idea how their kids are doing, that we can't use the SBAC or summative assessments to decide, where we can fund more algebra instruction or where kids are going. So as we go along, we know that kids are, as teachers, we know where kids are at. We're giving assessments. And so it's 3 times a year. And originally it was supposed to be in grades 3 through 8 math. In August, it was told to us, and then all of a sudden it's reading, and then all of a sudden it's K2 in Title I schools. So we're talking, I've been up many nights after the last IPC meeting that I testified because I'm so upset about it. Because basically what we're doing is kids of color and poor kids are getting over-tested. It is disgusting, it is inappropriate, and it is not okay. And basically, I was also trained when we're looking at the data, so you group out the kids because you can see where they're, not meeting. And when you're giving them a test where 50% of what they're getting is they're going to fail at, basically. And so we get groups of kids, and we were told to group kids. And I think as a district, pedagogically, we should not be tracking kids and tracking kids of color or tracking low-income kids. Thank you. Been wanting to say that.
And well said. Hi, my name's Caroline Caholen, and I teach 3rd grade at Llewellyn Elementary, and I'm a PPS parent. My daughter's going to graduate from Cleveland, and I'm a 9-year teacher here, mostly in 3rd grade. I was 5 years on the Care and Equity Committee. I'm the dyslexia coordinator for my building, and I'm in the leadership committee as well, just to kind of give you, and I appreciate you respectively listening to the on-the-ground perspective, and my comments aren't as written out because I really want to respond and try and make some connections. Welcome to our world. The exact conversations that have led you here for 3 hours tonight are what we are doing in the hallways and in our staff rooms and trying to fit in throughout the past months. I want to give a couple compliments just to because we always got to have a little positive. In the GVC conversation, the scope and and sequence information that you saw and those relevance, I'm out of time, are the websites in EBL are working well. I mean, in terms of our accessibility. However, all this conversation we started with assessment, and everything you're connecting here is why workload, staffing levels, the staffing model has to stay on the forefront of conversation. You can see with all this that you're digesting how that impacts us when we're trying to go in, and now we're delivering it. So I have to take this tomorrow and deliver it to my 24 students. And during the testing in relative to MAPS, I agree absolutely with the very front part of that presentation. What good assessment is, what has happened in math with disintegrated curriculum, and that we need stronger coherent assessments. But I give probably the first quarter to my third graders half dozen, 10 different assessments for standards that correlate with the bridge. I have a report card I do 4 times a year. The more those are done well, done better, that's where I grade. That's where I inform my instruction. MAPS is a piece, and it is very much a district piece. I cannot go there first to inform my instruction. It told you a lot tonight. My MAP testing, I could sit and go through that data and have that big data conversation you just had. But I want to look at what the students are doing. I need all those assessments, and the more I can electronically enter them, the more I can rubric them, the more I can take that as my measurements versus a MAP test, which does not allow my students to use their best expression of learning, does not allow me to partial grade, talks in language that doesn't match my report card or what my standards are. It's just not a priority, let alone all the comments that Rebecca and you'll hear all the way through. It's not that I don't think those are important, but I want to give you that perspective otherwise. So again, I think that focus needs to change, and change dramatically in terms of what's happening both in math and how we're measuring and how you guys are receiving information. There's tons of information, you just can't get it. I have, what I do every year. So that's how and again, measuring how we are gonna measure our students. Thank you. Thank
you. Suzanne and Elizabeth asked to speak.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for your time, being so late. I want to focus not so much on whether or not the MAP assessment is good or not, but just kind of like what we're doing as a district. But as far as the philosophy question, I mean, one thing that pains me was to see it embedded into our framework of assessment, which that collaborative work with PPS that was done over many years is based on the work of Rick Stiggins, who clearly outlines the experience for a student when they're taking an exam. And that an exam is, like, students need to feel success. And when you are given an exam and you cannot answer the questions correctly, when it's not on stuff you've been taught, that feeling of failure. And this can happen with high-achieving, anxious students, as well as low-achieving students who feel that challenge. And so we've now are working with an assessment that just kind of guarantees that every single student taking it has to experience that level of failure. And I think that's a philosophy conversation I'd love for us to have. But right now I want to talk about the 5-year plan, the inconsistencies that I heard in tonight's testimony, and maybe to clarify some things. So we've brought up concerns with the MAP testing since the first administration. We brought it up with the superintendent. We've brought it up with our Instructional and Professional Development Council. So this statement, for example, about whether or not students should be taking the test in 2 different languages at the same time. That was a question that we asked in November and said we needed an answer by our December meeting, which was yesterday. At this point in time, no one can answer whether or not a student should have to take a test twice in 2 different languages. So it's hard to even know how to begin the philosophy conversation about what best practices is. when people aren't aligned. And that goes back to your comments about, like every principal got to choose and how did they choose and who's monitoring how many different things are happening at once within a certain school and how could things like that happen. We had educators who gave their students the test in 2 different languages come and speak to PPS about that. So having that, it didn't happen is pretty indicative of what it's going to take for us to actually be successful at something. So that's kind of like my big overarching thing here is our district's big, it's growing, there's plenty of areas to look at, to adapt. What should our focus, how much time have we spent, what is our focus for our educators when we talked about leveraging work that's been done, providing equity, opportunity, curriculum. I mean, look at our special education students that still don't have good curriculum adoptions. There's so much work that we could be focusing on. Student safety, climate discipline, these are things that we've been talking about for a long time that are a foundation to good teaching and to being able for students to be able to learn. And when there's those kinds of disruptions happening in the classroom, there's real immediate needs that time and attention needs to be looked at. So at this point in time, we have still not gotten clear answers on a certain thing. We know that it was a district plan to roll out the MAP test for 3rd through 8th grade. And maybe that's a good test, and maybe it isn't. And this should be that opportunity to work on that. But with this overexpansion, there's been technology issues, there's differences, and no one can answer should kindergartners be taking this, and who decided, and do we want to stop it? What about kindergartners are taking it in Spanish and in English, in math and in reading? And so what I appreciate the time you're spending, and I think what I want to just point out is that not everyone's even clear on what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. And it's important to slow down, get things right, gather the good input, and really kind of concretely define some specific answers to questions that people are wondering, because the next testing window's in January, and we still do not have some really basic answers to questions. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, and hi, good to see you guys all tonight. I was part of the committee that created that balanced assessment framework, and I'm really happy to see it being brought to this group because it's, I think, some really important work. And it's work that's important to me. And Allison, who had to leave because she teaches early in the morning and needs to go to bed, she was on that committee too, and I know it's work that's really important to her, having a district that has a strong assessment policy that makes sense and serves kids well, and also meets the needs of a district. And one of the slides that was shown had those concentric circles of formative assessment being the bulk of the assessment we do, with interim and summative assessments being thin rings on the outside. And I want to be clear, MAP testing is not a formative assessment. It is an interim assessment. Formative assessments are created by teachers, are flexible to be used, and relate directly to what you're teaching so that right then when you give it, you can adjust. Most formative assessments are very quick. They might take a number of seconds. It might be a question I ask. It might be an exit slip at the end of a class so that I can adjust the next day. But a formative assessment is not something that takes a week of instruction for a student to use and may or may not be related to what I was teaching them in the first place. I want you guys to be clear about the kind of instructional time that MAP testing used. When we heard of the plan, the original plan in August, we were told that MAP testing would be about an hour per kid 3 times a year, and that's only for kids grades 3 through algebra. And we also heard that after the testing window closed, PPS gathered data about the average time that students were logged in, and we were told, look, it was about the same. It was about an hour per kid. But what we were hearing from teachers is that an hour per kid logged in is not the same as an hour of lost instructional time for many reasons. Because logging in a class full of first graders does not take 0 time. It takes a lot of time. And kids were getting logged out, and there were technical difficulties. But despite any difficulties, kids have to take time to get logged in. We know not all kids can concentrate through 60 minutes of a standardized test, so kids were stopping and then starting the next day. And we also know that however much time it takes the average kid is not what's important in a class. What's important is how long it takes the class to finish. And so when we asked teachers, what's the amount of time it took you to get back to instruction, the average answer from teachers was 3 hours. Per test.
And so then I want you to remember that in our Title I schools especially, students were taking this test in math and English, starting in kindergarten, and we will be doing that 4 times a year. So that is 3 hours times 2 tests, times 3 times a year, 18 hours of instructional time. For students who are doing that in 2 languages, that's twice as much, so 36 hours of instructional time potentially per student. And I want to weigh this against one of the goals I know this board has expressed, and expressed today actually, is the importance of our instructional time. How are we going to get through the curriculum that we believe is important? How are we going to get through the standards that we believe is important for our students? And while we have this new guaranteed viable curriculum that we're asking teachers to follow, we're also asking them to make time for dozens of hours of testing that haven't been accounted for. And I also want to point out something that was said in relation to the results of the MAP testing that you saw. These tests are verifying what we already know. And that is how teachers feel about MAPS testing. This is information we already know about our kids. No teacher waited until October to find out which of their kids are behind in reading, which of their kids are struggling with computation, which of their kids don't know how to do word problems. Those are things we figured out in August. In ways that our kids might not even notice that we were gathering data on them, because this is what teachers do. We start the first minute we meet a kid and we gather data, and we're assessing them formatively so that we can give them the instruction they need without them even noticing that instruction stopped, because it didn't stop. And so when we talk about the need to have a balanced assessment system, we're supposed to be valuing the student's education and making sure that those rings of need for people in this building to be able to look into our classrooms is not getting in the way of students' need to learn. And I think that perhaps an unintended consequence of choosing this system is that it gives tons of fascinating information. I love those reports too. I could look at them for hours. But if that is at the expense of students' learning opportunity, that is not an ethical decision to make. I think that I can stop there, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And happy to answer questions if you have, now or privately or other ways if you have them about what we've heard from teachers about how this is going. Yeah, thanks.
I think the silence you're hearing is 10 p.m.
Yeah, I'm feeling it too.
Okay. Anything else for the good of the order? Okay. We're going to adjourn, and the next regular meeting is next Tuesday on the 11th. Thank you. Good night.